17 U.S.C. 107 federal law allows citizens to use copyrighted media for fair use. That is criticism, news reporting, teaching, and parody.
Kuma, Yahua, Weaputsu Oyedeka, Neanusa Misaneka, arise of you, O Yahua. Kuma, let your enemies be scattered, and let those that hate thee flee from before thee. Let all of Yasharah, Yisrael, who love, worship, and praise Yahweh, give him thanks by saying hallelujah.
Shalom and welcome to Into All Truth. We welcome donations and we thank you everyone for donations that you made for calendars and cookbooks, which the update should be coming out before the new Hebrew year, the new Israelite year. Make a donation of $35 or more at livelifewell.com and you'll get both the calendar and the Hebraic lifestyle Chaya Eat Life and Fast book. You will get the calendar and the cookbook. Just remind me to send you an update once you've purchased it with a proof of receipt. We thank you for everyone who's donated, and I pray that as you listen to this study that the Ruach HaKodesh will lead you into all truth and show you things to come. Baruch atah Kulam, in the name of Yahushua HaMashiach. The Kabbalah says that in order to make someone into a slave, you have to make them white, blanco, into a tabla rasa, a blank slate. Blank is what black means. Part of that is erasing memory and mixing with the white soul of the bleached seed of the fallen. So this is a continuation of the shift of the identity from Jacob to Esau and back again, because Esau is the end of the world and Jacob is the beginning of it that follows. This is the rise of the fourth man. Welcome back to the second part of this series on Prester John. You guys, it's so much information to cover and I really can't do it justice. So I have to go by broader principles, but this episode is called Prester John Fourth Man Beast Mode, because Noah had 3 sons, but there was a fourth man on the planet. And he was not the fourth man who was in the fire, but he's trying to imitate the fourth man that was in the furnace of fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so the Septuagint says, behold, therefore, behold, the days will come, saith Yahua, when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Yehuda with the seed of man and the seed of... So that beast is the fourth man. So remember, guys, a lot of this is speculation. I'm going by scripture to be the guide because the Ruach HaKodesh can lead us into all truth and show us things to come. But a lot of it is also still theory and speculation, tying things together with the history of scripture. Let's get into Prester John and who he is. So one of the things that I looked up, somebody on the channel commented that I was like, what does Ethiopia mean? And they said utopia. And so there was this kind of utopia that is established in the West as the dreamland to begin to set up Babylon. And of course the West was already active, but then it has to be hidden, as I said, to set up Babylon. So that's what this episode is about. It's about the transition from Israel to Babylon. And so we look at this image. This is a Saurian from the Esau tribe among the Ethiopians, right? And so this is our typical Prester John image here, and he's got his scepter. He's a brown-skinned man, and you see he's ruling these tents of Tartaria and the Mongols in the distance. He's on his platform. He's got his cross, and he's holding his hand out. And it is kind of like in a curse, because you see these young Edomites down here, these Muslim Edomites in European times, and they've got their Israelite brothers in captivity sitting around going, "Brother, what are you doing? Why are you taking us captive? This is not nice." And they're hexing them. They got the hand and the curse sign the same way. So this is kind of the story of the relationship between Esau and Jacob down here. And this is the journey that we go on from the Israelitish kings, as we've already discussed, Mansa Musa and some other ones, eventually to the Muslim kings, and then the Ishmaelite kings to the Edomite kings, and then the Canaanite Kongs, the Mongolians and the KAZARS and the Europeans, of course. So I just thought I would share this utopia idea with you, because it is a kind of utopia that they build in the Eden in the West as they're awaiting to set up Babylon again. Another thing I wanted to look at was the curse that is on Israel, that the land shall be a desolation, and they shall serve among the Gentiles 70 years, and when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will take vengeance upon that nation, and will make them a perpetual desolation, which I will bring upon that land, and all my words which I've spoken against it, even all the things that are written in this book. So this is the time of Jacob's trouble, when he is being scattered to the four corners of the earth. Esau is chasing him, and Esau is taking over the whole world and about to set up Babylon. And part of this is the 7 nations, the beasts, the seed of the beasts with no nation. But I want to be very clear again that there is a definite connection between the Ethiopians, as I've said, through Keturah, through the Midianites, etc., being part of the promised land. And the Edomites currently dwelling there, the Midianites still dwelling there, and there being this whole connection to the cycle of captivity of Joseph, where the brothers sell Joseph into slavery, the Midianites pick him up, the Ishmaelites sell him to Egypt, the Edomites, sorcerers and kings, keep them captive and enslave them, and then they escape, and the Midianites help them, and then they have to make their way through the nations. But one of the things I wanted to show you was, I did show you the translation that I was given in various videos, ASHABA for Ethiopia. But I looked at it myself in Hebrew, and with some of my brothers and sisters who, we're not experts, but we study it. We look at it together. So we have ASHABA. So Aish is Ishi, apple of my eye, or wife is Aish, or it also means fire. Fire of creation, when a man and woman come together. So that's A-Shin, A-B-A. So that's Aleph, Shin, Aleph, Beit, Aleph. So ASHABA. So this is the wife of Abba, the people or house of Abba, because the B implies the house, Beit. Aleph is the leader, and Shin is taking hold of the leader of the house. A knight, and they're calling them all the same guy, St Maurice. I can't believe how much this guy got around Europe. He was everywhere, and everyone made a statue of him. I was just like, who would believe such a thing? It's absolutely idiotic. So I would just be like, oh my gosh. And I would be looking at them going, okay, who is this really though? So these are the black Moorish knights and nobles and aristocracy in Europe, Germany, all the way through Britain. And so this is the legend of St Maurice actually masks the black aristocracy. Okay? And here's where you can find the information. You can go to Real History. They've always got something that you need on there. They're such good researchers. So let's look at the legend of St Maurice, because it ties back to all of this. Okay, so there's this story about this St Maurice who allegedly died circa 286, and he was a Christian soldier whose alleged martyrdom with his comrades inspired a cult still practiced today. Among those martyred with him were the SS Vitalis Candidus Experitus. So they were candid spirits, candid, hidden spirits, candid people. He's a patron saint of the Vatican Swiss Guard. And the story is recorded of this PCO martyrdom. And basically, it's the Passion of the Martyrs of Argonon. In the 5th century, French bishop St Eucherius believed that the Theban Legion was a group of Egyptian Christians serving in the Roman army under the command of Maurice, this guy. And ironically, they were sent by Maximilian, later the Roman Empire, to help quash a revolt of Christian peasants in Gaul. And the legion met with Maximilian at an octodoron, now Switzerland. And they refused to fight against their brethren and withdrew in protest to Agaunum. And there Maximilian twice had 1 man in 10 executed, and finally the entire group was put to death. Okay, so this is the legend. So who are these people then? Who is this great, wealthy, beautiful, venerated aristocracy that we see throughout Europe? Well, so again, there's some connections that I want you guys to make. When we think about Esau and Jacob, it's like thinking about the right hand and the left hand. Okay, so Jacob is the right hand, Esau is the left hand. And so the saying is, don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing. And Jacob is symbolized by the royal blue or purple for royalty, and Esau by the blood. He mixed in with the fallen angels who are blood drinkers, and his color is red. He's red and hairy all over. When he was born, he was ruddy, okay? And so this is like the difference between the Crips and the Bloods. The Crips were put in a deep sleep underneath the earth, okay? This is the crypto hidden Yehudis. And then the Bloods are the members of the gang who are related to Esau, Edom, and they're the blood drinkers. Now, as I said, Esau uses Solomon and David and Prester John and even Korah, who was descended from the line of Levi. Okay, so Levi, Samuel, this is where Moses and all that came through the line of Levi to become the priestly line. Remember that. He has taken all of these accomplishments of these individuals of Judah, tribe of Judah, John the apostle, John the prophet, King David and Solomon, and made them into titles and is appropriating the identity. There's also Judas Iscariot, names himself after Judah, and he's from among the Karaite Jews who are related to the Edomites. So Judas Iscariot was actually an Edomite, the one who betrayed Yahusha. We also know that the Amalekites, like Haile Selassie, his family are the ones who overthrew the Ethiopian Zagwe dynasty. And the Zagwe dynasty had amongst them members of the Midianites. The Midianites, Moses married the Midianite Zipporah, and Jethro was a priest in the order of, the Shemitic order. And so he helped to reinitiate Moses back into the priesthood. And so that's the Zagwe Ethiopians, okay? And so they were overthrown by the Edomites of Amalek. All right, Isaac calls his Shemitic sons, the Saxons, whereas they overthrew the Israelites. The Israelites call themselves Israel. Saxons, Isaac's sons. There's a difference between Nega versus Negad. Nega is a serpent, a charmer, an enchanter. Negad is a noble prince of good report. Okay? Pharaoh relates to the west, to pharaohs, and to the dust that was smitten by Moses and became flies. Okay? Africa is associated with Ophir, with gold, with light. And but they have a similar spelling and sound. There's Esau calls himself Jews, Juicy, Jute, whereas in Israel they would call themselves Yahya or Yehudi. They wouldn't call themselves Jews, or they call themselves Israel. Okay, and Esau is more symbolic of the west, Merkur, and Israel is symbolic of the east. And they both have land in the south, because the land given to Israel, given to Abraham and Shem in particular, was the land of revisionism and hiding of the west and hiding of Israel, which Hadrian promised to do. The east became west and west became east, so it was something that we were unpicking. We're going to go into the Karaite thing again. We're going to go into these conquests across the globe, AD to about 1200 AD up until the transatlantic slave trade. And this is the transition of these kings. And so geographically, the groups we cover are like kind of Western Europe here, so-called West. Arabs come and they take over a lot of Europe with the Israelites, who are force converted to the Arabic religions. So this is Ishmael with the scattered tribes. Then we have Charlemagne, who is up in the land of the 10 tribes, and he's holding the north part, and he's an Edomite, and there's a lot of kings that come out of Charlemagne to rule Western Europe and take it over from the Israelites, okay? But the Yehudi are used by the Arabs to take over the western lands of the Israelites, who've been scattered anyway. Some of them are still holding on, but they're pretty well scattered. And Western Europe is occupied by Gauls and people like that. And so the Arabs and the Yehudi push them out, okay, for a season. So Charlemagne basically resists the former Yahudi who have lined up, the West African Yahudi who have lined up with the Ishmaelite Arabs and begin to conquer the northern lands that have had their royalty scattered or thinned out. But Charlemagne begins to align himself with the Gentiles to reserve those territories for them. The Holy Roman Empire. So he is a Prester John. Okay, he is a king and a priest. And around Russia, we have the Assyrian Ivanovs. I'm saying there's a lot of guys in the Byzantine Empire named Ivan, and they're Edomites. You know, they all look like this. They all have this face, you know, that I talk about. West of that, so heading towards North America into the Khazarian land, you have Prester John, the Khazarians, the Mongoloids, the Tartarians, and the fighting Muslims all together. And Prester John is able to overcome the Muslims and get the Mongoloids under his empire. And then further on into the west, into America and so on, the 10 tribes are fighting with the 7 nations, and they're serving Prester John. Okay? They're serving Prester John, and they're fighting the 7 nations. And so with that being said, there's always this battle that Israel has had with the 7 nations, with the fallen seed. Okay? And like I said, there's the slaughter of kings that took place. The slaughter of kings, which Abraham slaughtered these 7 kings when he had to return Lot, when Sodom and Gomorrah was overrun by these nations. And so he had to go and get Lot and get all their wealth back. And that's when Melchizedek came and he gave 1/10 of everything to Melchizedek, Shem. Okay? And then Genesis 34:1, the 7 nations slaughter. And this is when Simeon, Levi, and Judah avenge Dinah. When the king of Shechem takes her and just takes her home and rapes her. That's just how they are. They just see a woman, they see one of the Shemitic women, and they say, I want her. And then they'll slaughter your whole nation to get her. Okay? And so this kind of speaks to one of the incidents that happens with Prester John and the Mongolians. Okay? Now, it's something that's important for you to know is that the scripture, Yah, calls the end from the beginning. So there are many battles with the 7 nations. Okay, and the 7 nations come out of Mount Seir, Mount Horeb, Hermes, where the 200 angels descended and mixed in with the blood of women. They defiled themselves with the blood of women. And so this is how the giants were born, the Nephilim were born, the seed of Canaan was born. And so this is always Israel's battle to fight this seed. And it's actually, I believe, part of the Iliad when the gods or the descendants of Edom as gods go after these giants as well. That's why it's Iliad, Yah's right hand. And so this is part of the journey that the 10 tribes are on as they're in the land of Egypt. And so, like I said, the Danites have been fighting the 7 nations up until this day, is what this book is going to tell us. Okay, in Lost Tribes in the Promised Land, page 44, these Danites, you know, and it's all 10 tribes, really. They've mixed in with a lot of the Gentiles and stuff, but not necessarily 7 nations. It says, finally, God gave them good courage and advice, namely to go up the river Pishon, and they reached the land of Ethiopia, which they found fertile with numerous vineyards and gardens. Thus the Danites dwelled there for many years, multiplying and increasing greatly. And they were then followed by 3 other tribes, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, who crossed the desert and encamped until they came to the land of the Danites. In their wanderings, they slew many Ethiopians in a territory extending 4 kingdoms up to this day, and these 4 tribes and those who dwelt in the ancient Havilah, where there is gold, trusted in the Lord. Okay, so this was the scattering of the 10 tribes. You have Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. They didn't return after the building of the 7th temple, and the Danites. So they're in the 3rd India. And they're fighting, they're killing giants and fighting these 7 nations that I spoke of, okay, who have the seed of Satan. All right, and so we're going to see a lot of these images of these black Arabs and these people, these Cathay people who are mixed in with other races. And what we find is an island in the Indies, and there are people different from any other. On some of the mountains of this island, there are men of great stature, that is some 16 feet tall, like giants, who are very black and without rational faculties. They eat white strangers whenever they can. This is in Lost Tribes in the Promised Lands, and there are many more accounts of all of these giants and strange beings all throughout these books. And of course in Tartaria, we know well, which I showed some of it in the last video. I may show a little bit here too. So, but nonetheless, giant killing, giant slaying. Of course, the evidence of that is that we have this ancient piece of pottery that depicts one of the probably 10 tribes and Alexander the Great slaying giants. And here he is with a brother with dreadlocks, probably 10 tribes, helping him out. All right? And Alexander the Great, of course, is the one who brought the moon calendar to the Israelites and forced them to worship times and seasons according to the moon. And of course, here's the reminder that in the book of Esther, and many of the people of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews fell upon them. So this is when the Edomites became Jews and started calling themselves Jews. Hence we get Prester, John, the king, priest, king. The timeline discussed in the other videos is the scattering and of Israel and now Yehuda, and the conquest of Spain and North Africa with the Ishmaelites, Yehuda and the scattered 10 tribes and the Ishmaelites. And so I wanted to talk again about Mauritania and the relationship between Israel, the other Shemitic descendants of Abraham and Isaac, and the identity of the Moor, because it's another stolen identity. You'll see that in my other video. And those videos, I don't really have the full understanding that that actually is the land of Abraham, as I now do. So just keep an eye out for that. So this is isaria.nu. That's where I got all this information from. So it goes into some of this history. And remember, I told you the Phoenicians and the Sidonians were Isaurians and likely Ishmaelites, Sudanese, okay? And so we remember that even by 1100 BC, so 1150, or I guess around 1050 BC is around the time that Solomon's kingdom was set up. So the northern kingdom was already in their lands. And as I said before, I believe that the northern kingdom was actually Western Britain, because the borders of the land of Abraham were simply the Egyptian Sea. So the Egyptian waters, which is basically the Atlantic or the Ethiopic Ocean, right? And then the other border on the east was the Euphrates. There was no northern or southern border. So I believe the northern kingdom was North Africa and Western Europe. And there's a lot of conversation about them having seafaring people. So this site, Isaria, timeline is a great timeline to consult. So it says the Phony Asians set up Morocco around here. And these were Berber tribes fishing in Mogador Bay in the Morocco area. So this is a long time ago. That's almost 3,100 years ago. And it says even 2,000 or more. Now they go into 10,000. I believe in a biblical timeline. So it could have been even before that, even 2,000 years, or at least, 1,500 BC. Okay, but we know 1,100 BC, the 10 tribes would have been in place in these regions. And we know that when Judah actually went to Egypt, he secured the gates of Gibraltar. So he passed through this area to go to Egypt, and he secured these gates. When we talk about, the Masons and Solomon and all that kind of stuff, HARAM, ABIFF, and Solomon knew a secret password to open these gates of Gibraltar. And these are the two-leaved gates that Cyrus is given to open and to access the promised land when the Gentiles and other nations are given the kingdom of Israel. So these are these two-leaved gates. And so this land is a northern kingdom. So it says the Phoenicians set up their trading posts. Now remember that Jonah has to warn Nineveh and all that kind of stuff, and he gets in the ships of Tarshish and all that kind of thing. So the northern kingdom were seafaring people. So were the people of Tarshish. Okay, so they had relationships, and they all tie into what? Tyre, the prince of Tyre. And the prince of Tyre ties into Esau, Edom, and the Phoenicians. So even back to 1100 and earlier, the Mauritanians were here. And you're going to be the 10 tribes who watch my channel, and I really appreciate you being here, you guys. I love you. Just want you to know that, remember, the identity of Israel is constantly being hijacked and stolen. Constantly. And so you're going to learn more about the 10 tribes here. So the Phoenicians had their settlement here, and then the Numidians. But remember, and it says Juba II established a Tyrian purple factory processing morex and shells found in this area. Now Atlantis would have been to the west here. And it talks about them. So it wasn't there where they so-called Israel today. This is where the ships were going back and forth to the Americas from here. And the ships of Tyre, they were going up to Britain and over around to Yavan, and they were distributing goods all over the world, the ships of Tyre. And so were the ships of Israel, the northern kingdom, because they were seafaring people. Okay, so here's the timeline and some of the maps. And so this is a great site to go to get a sense of the timelines And so you have the Arab invasion in the 700s. Remember, we talked about Tariq in the last video, Ibn Ziyad. And we talked about Masa Musa, who was an African king. So that's basically the Hebrews in Western Africa. And you see Idris, the Arabs, invading in that area. They're serving the Arabs, force converted Israelites in the 700s, invading that area and them invading into Europe, into the 10 tribes land, which had been invaded what? By the Gentiles, which we talked about in the last video. And who's Idris Elba? The Idrisids. Okay, so these are likely the Ishmaelites, because remember the order is the Gibeonites take Joseph captive after he's sold by his brothers. Then the Ishmaelites pick him up and take him to Egypt. Then in Egypt he is enslaved. And then the Pharaoh arises who does not know Joseph. In other words, doesn't have a good relationship with him. And those lines of pharaohs and all of those priests are related to Esau, Edom, and the Gentiles, and they keep him captive. They keep Israel captive. So that's the pattern over and over again. And so this is a good reference. Look, Traveler Drake. Who's Drake? Drake is Esau, right? We know who the rapper Drake is. He's Esau. All right, so here's a timeline here again. Remember, I showed it in the last video. So the Assyrian captivity is 700 to 600 BC. And so that's some of the 10 tribes go east up into Eastern Europe, into the Mongolia land. Others are up in Britain and head west to North America. The ones that take ships or go across the Bering Crossing as well to North America. This is the evolution of Mauritania. So who are the Moors? Remember, when we're talking about the Moors, we're always discussing this identity that everybody wants, right? And so who are the true Moors? The true Moors above all other Moors? Well, when we look it up, Morashti, and in that day, Yahua came to Micah the Morishite in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Yehuda, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Micah the Morishite prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and spake to all the people of Judah, saying, Thus saith Yahua of hosts, Zion shall be plowed like a field, and Jerusalem shall be in heaps, and the mountain of the house as high places of a forest. So this is the destruction of the northern kingdom and all of Israel eventually. But who is Micah the Morishite? Well, Micah the Morishite is of the northern kingdom. He's a prophet of the 10 tribes. He's a Morishite. You guys may not like it, but what's the story? The story is that Abraham, see, and read this as I'm talking about it, inhabitant of Moresheth, prophet Micah. So Abraham had Ishmael first. Ishmael coveted the firstborn son position. All right? He had 6 sons after having Isaac, who also coveted the firstborn son position. So what happened when Israel went into captivity? They were sold. Joseph went into captivity. He was sold by his brothers, right? Sold by his brothers. The Midianites pick him up. Who are the Midianites? One of the 6 sons of Keturah. They also coveted the identity of Isaac and Israel. So when Israel is in captivity in Egypt, who's dwelling at Mount Sinai where the temple is built. The Midianites, why? Because they wanted that identity. So did Ishmael. So did Esau, who sold his birthright. So it's always a story of Israel originating an identity and then the other ones co-opting it. Mordecai with the root Mor. He was a Benjaminite, the uncle of Esther. Moreh is a teacher of law. Moreshgath is a part of the 10 tribe lands. Moriah is the mountain of the temple. Hill of the teacher. So I say it on my opening. Hill of the teacher. Resh is the word for head. Mor Resh means head or belonging to. Micah was a Morishite. Ite means descendant of the Moors. It also means a prophet or teacher of the law. So somebody stole your identity and you're rejecting it because the person who stole it has associated it with a bunch of negative things, including your enslavement and captivity. Maroon can be copper colored. The Maroons were on the islands of Jamaica, right? On the islands of Jamaica, they hid in the mountains, as they are wont to do. Moriah, Moray, people of the mountain land. The Maroons hid in the mountains. Moriah means people chosen by Yahua, seen of Yah. That's what it means. Name of a hill where Solomon built the temple. Land of Moriah, region that is in the mountains, district of Moriah. Chosen by Yahuwah. Yod of union, that's the right hand, chosen by Yahuwah, a name which is very suitable for a sanctuary. Shalom. All right? And or, it has the word or in it, meaning light or gold. So this is the true meaning of more. So don't be giving it away or smacking the people who stole it from you and saying it's useless. Okay, that's why, you know, some people will talk about the Book of Mormon. Now it's corrupted, I'm sure. I haven't read it. But like, you know, some of the outside books, they do get a bit corrupted. They're mixing truth with a lie because Esau got his grubby hands on them. Like some of these other books. So they have to be reconciled with Scripture. But I'm just showing this to you to show you oftentimes it's referring to the northern kingdom, the Moors. What does England have? A lot of Moors. Where's the northern kingdom? Britain, Spain. In the last video, Tariq and Mansa Musa fought over what? The Table of Solomon that was hidden in the northern kingdom. So don't be so quick to give it to the Ishmaelites. They coveted it. They coveted it and thief it from you. Them take it and gone, and you think it belongs to them, but it's not. It's your name. And the place of Shechem, the plain of Moreh, the land of who? Manasseh. Who's included in the 144,000? Manasseh. That's where the plain of Moreh is. Unto thy seed will I give this land, and there he built an altar unto Yahuwah, who appeared to him in Genesis 2:6-27. This is a promise to Abraham. This is the land of Shechem. Now, don't believe this map on the right. This is where Israel agreed to be cursed or blessed, determined by whether or not they could keep the law. All right, so don't give up on Moreh. Moreh is a teacher of the law. Okay, we're going by the word. That's the ultimate measure.
A big chunk of Europe, what is known as the Iberian Peninsula, that are taken over by black troops and Arab types which are both black as well as a few of them being fair-skinned types. We do know that in the Umayyad dynasty something very unusual begins to happen. First of all, the Muslims show themselves to be extremely generous in victory. Instead of trying to destroy everything they find in Europe and plant their own stuff in they allow the Europeans to live side by side with them. As they say, they retreated Muslim, Jew, and Christian alike. The Jews, in fact, assist the Muslims to defeat the Christians because the Christians are persecuting the Jews. So this is another factor that we find in the world of the Umayyads. Another thing unusual that begins to happen is that wherever races are strange to each other or are polarized, you find magnetic attractions between races. Wherever you have polarization, you have this occurring. And you find, for example, that the Jews who had already been made slaves, now their slavery is up. Important thing to note here is that something began to happen which is very unfortunate, and that is the white slave trade. Slave comes from Slav. And the reason why the word slave comes from Slav is that the first slaves are white. The Arabs and the Jews get involved in this. It is said that Abdurrahman had nothing to do with it. He did not give it its blessing, etc. But they seem to have some sort of secret on-the-ground slave trade going on. And you find, just as when the whites took over countries, they brought black women into their harems, or at least had secret liaisons with black women. You have white women finding themselves into the concubinages or harems of Arabs and Africans. Because when the Muslims cracked up in Europe, the Africans were thrust again into Europe and sustained the Muslim dynasties. Thus it is that just around the time the Caliph is dethroned, we find something happening, beginning to happen in Africa. A man called Yahya, an African called Yahya, is developing a movement in the Sahara. An African called Yahya is developing a movement in the Sahara. An African called Yahya is developing a movement in the Sahara. He sovereign, a sultan who takes full control from about 1086 AD, and this runs for a whole century. This century, very remarkable things happen. The Africans have their court in Africa and their court in Spain, just as the Europeans later were to have their empire consolidated at home and abroad. The Africans have their courts in Africa and their courts in Spain. And the Almoravids, they are very strong until Yusuf dies, and then comes his son, who is not as strong. A man arises, a leader in Africa in the early 12th century, who calls himself Mahdi, or the Mahdi, and his followers begin to strengthen themselves, and they push aside the Almoravids, and they invade Europe, and by 1150, their armies defeat the Christians of Spain. This is the last of the great African dynasties. It runs right through to 1230 AD, when eventually the Christians begin to push the Africans back. About 3 million Africans go back down into Africa, and the things begin to break up in the Iberian Peninsula, and it still holds a certain strength for about 200 years, until 1492, the very year Columbus sailed. The last great battle between the Christians and the Moors occurred, and the Christians are finally defeated at Granada, and a massive destruction of Moorish documents occurred. But what did the Moors bring to Europe? Europe was in the dark age. Whatever the Greeks may have done, whatever the Romans may have done, Europe had fallen into grave decline. European science was a joke compared to African and Asian science. The Europeans, for example, one of them was trying to show that the distance from the Earth to the Moon was the diameter of the Earth. In order to write the diameter of the Earth, he calculated or estimated the circumference and divided it by 2. That was the level of science. There was no complex mathematics, no complex science in either in Spain or any part of Europe at that time. Many advances that had been made by the Greeks and Romans were lost. So that when Chandler calls his article Light of Europe's Dark Age, this is a very true and precise statement of what was happening. Then comes the Moors. And the Moors caused a massive movement of knowledge into the places where they settled. Thus we find that Spain becomes the main center for the translation of all the works of antiquity. Egyptian works and all other works that are translated into Arabic, then they're translated into Spanish, then they're translated into Latin. Thus Europe becomes open, and the Muslims become open to the knowledge of the world. They thrust into India, they bring back various things. How many of us know that the Europeans only counted with letters? The Europeans did not have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you talk about Roman numerals, it's IX and X, and those are letters. The Greeks used letters to count with. The Romans used letters. It is the Indian, the Hindu, who had those numerals, and Arabs brought it out of India. Many things were brought out of Egypt. Many things were brought out of various parts of the world in order to build what was later to be known as Western civilization. So that we have an extraordinary situation. One of the things that is most remarkable is that the very things that were used to defeat us came from outside of Europe. Artillery, firearms are not European in origin. People like to say, oh, we defeated you because we had superior firepower. Where did they get it from? The Arabs. A manuscript in Leningrad, an Arabic manuscript, shows the first use of artillery by the Moors in a battle with the Indians. The chemical components of gunpowder are developed through the chemistry of the Moors. The Europeans do not know about gunpowder. Gunpowder had been used even earlier by the Egyptians, but it was not used in the way it was used by the Europeans later on. But the Arabs used it in that way. They did use it in artillery. And the first firing of artillery in the world is by the Moors. And the first use of gunpowder in that context. And the ships were so absolutely critical to the expansion of the European empire. Look at those ships. Take the caravel, for example, the Portuguese caravel. Many of the nautical instruments, the compass, the astrolabe, are not invented in Europe. They are brought in by the Moors from other parts of the world, so that Spain, where the Moors concentrated, became a center through which all of these things coalesced. That is the reason why Spain was able to make the first major thrust, and Portugal, not because of any other special advantage, because when we compare what was happening in the rest of Europe, we are appalled. Let me wars in Europe. In Cordova, the old packed Cordova, they found a city of 250,000 houses and 1 million people, when no city in Europe outside Moorish Spain had a population of 30,000. Its massive walls had a circuit of 14 miles and had 7 large iron gates faced with brass. Its streets were paved so soundly indeed that in some of them you tread the same stones today. Just as you cross the Guadalquivir on the same noble bridge, drained by large sewers, flushed with water from the many fountains which sparkled in the sun, and lit by lamps at night. It had 80,455 shops, besides 4,300 markets, and in these you could buy amber from the Baltic, Russian furs, Chinese tea, Indian spices, African ebony and ivory, and more than 1,000 mosques, the largest of which is still one of the architectural wonders of the world in spite of latest Spanish disfigurement. Its low scarlet and gold roof, supported by 1,000 columns of marble, jasper, and porphyry, was lit by thousands of brass and silver lamps which burned perfumed oil, the largest being 38 feet in circumference, containing 46,000 silver plates for reflecting the light. The exquisite prayer chamber, the unique pulpit, and the caliph's private section with floors of silver and gold-plated doors completed this wonderful monument of opulence and art. When we look at the arts and sciences, and that is something that is most remarkable, paper was introduced by the Moors into Spain. The windmill was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Gunpowder was introduced into Europe by the Moors. Artillery was introduced into Europe by the Moors. The nautical instruments like the astrolabe and the compass, the three-cornered or four-cornered axial rudder, the three-masted ships, all these were introduced by the Moors. Here we have claiming about all of this tremendous industrial revolution that came purely out of European genius. While in the 10th and 11th centuries all Europe could show scarcely a single public library, note this, and could boast of only 2 universities that were worthy of the name, there were in Spain at that same time under the Moors more than 70 public libraries, of which the one in Cordova alone contained 600,000 manuscripts. In addition, the country possessed 17 famous universities, among which those at Cordova, Seville, Granada, Malaga, Jaén, Valencia, Almeria, and Toledo were especially outstanding. Astronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics, geometry, philology, geography reached in Spain the highest stage at the time known anywhere. Artists and scholars united in special associations for the pursuit of their studies. There were regular congresses of all branches of science where the latest achievements of research were announced and discussed, which naturally contributed greatly to the spread of scientific thought. Another most amazing thing was that the Moors were the first to introduce air conditioning. They heated the houses in the winter, and they did an unusual thing which we do not even do now. When they brought cool air into the house, it wasn't just cool, it was perfumed. They ran it over banks of flowers, noted for their perfume. Art, literature, and science prospered as they then prospered nowhere else in Europe. Students flocked from France and Germany and England to drink from the fountain of learning which flowed only in the cities of the Moors. The surgeons and doctors were in the van of science. Women were encouraged to devote themselves to serious study, and the lady doctor was not unknown among the people of Cordova. Mathematics, astronomy, and botany, history, philosophy, and jurisprudence were to be mastered in Spain and Spain alone. The practical work of the field, the scientific methods of irrigation, the arts of fortification and shipbuilding, the highest and most elaborate products of the loom, the graver, and the hammer, the potter's wheel, and the mason's trowel were brought to perfection by the Spanish Moors. And when we come to the end, and this is something that I really have to read, when we come to the very end, because it's said in words that one cannot equal in speech, the death that occurs in Spain, the death of greatness after the Moors are banished. In 1492, the last bulwark of the Moors gave way before the crusade of Ferdinand and Isabella, and with Granada fell all of Spain's greatness. For a brief while, indeed, the reflection of the Moorish splendor cast a borrowed light on the history of the land which was at once warmed with its sunny radiance. The great epoch of Isabella, Charles V, and Philip II, of Columbus, Cortez, and Pizarro shed a last halo about the dying monuments, the dying moments of a mighty state. Then followed the abomination of desolation, the rule of the stupid Inquisition, and the blackness of darkness in which Spain has been plunged ever since. In the land where science was once supreme, the Spanish doctors became noted for nothing but their ignorance and incapacity. And the discoveries of Newton and Harvey were condemned as pernicious to the faith. Where once 70 public libraries had fed the minds of scholars and 500,000 books had been gathered at Cordova for the benefit of the world, such indifference to learning afterwards prevailed that the new capital, Madrid, possessed not a single public library in the 18th century. Note that. The Moors left. They were kicked out at the end of the 15th century, having left 70 libraries. And when the Africans and Arabs were forced to return back into Africa by the 18th century, they didn't have one public library. The 16,000 looms of Seville soon dwindled to a fifth of their ancient number. The arts and industries of Toledo and Almeria faded into insignificance. The very baths, public buildings of equal ornament and use, were destroyed because cleanliness savored too strongly of rank infidelity. Note that. Do you know it was a sin to smile, to show any kind of sensuality, laughter during the Inquisition in some of the courts? The land deprived of the skillful irrigation of the Moors grew impoverished and neglected. The richest and most fertile valleys languished and were deserted. Most of the populous cities which had filled every district of Andalusia fell into ruinous decay, and beggars, friars, and bandits took the place of scholars, merchants, and knights. So low fell Spain when she had driven away the blacks. Such is the melancholy contrast offered by her history. And this is by Stanley Lane Poole, by the way.
ASHABA, Ishaba, Ishaba. This is the Ethiopian for Abyssinia, or married to Abba, but it becomes Abyssinia. So there's a whole order and identity theft and transition that goes from this. So this is really about that journey of kings and how Yah allows Hasatan to do it through Esau and these various nations. So we're going to look at Roland Saunders' Lost Tribes of the Promised Land. We're going to read from that and a number of other books. Let's just start off with this, though. So how did the Mongoloids arise out of the black Presters? And were they ever defeated at any point, the Hebrew ones? And how did that enable the Edomite ones to rise? Well, it's kind of hard to unpick the differences, but let's just start with this. So back to Prester John. Among all the theories put forward to account for Prester John's origin, 3 have seemed sufficiently plausible to be taken seriously by scholars. In the opinion of these German scholars, the real Prester was the Mongolian conqueror Yalu Tashi, founder of the Central Asian Empire of Karakate, who in 1141 defeated the Seljuk Sultan Sanyar at Katwan near Samarkand. His victory was overwhelming. The news of it in garbled form soon reached Europe. Such tidings were very welcome just then, because the Western Christians had recently experienced grave setbacks in the Near East and had lost some of the territory won in the First Crusade. The conqueror at Katwan could be identified as a non-Muslim from beyond the eastern frontier of Islam, and Europe in fancy straightway made him a Christian. So they said, oh, he's got to be a Christian. The idea was not utterly fantastic. Here, according to the German writers, began the legend of Prester John, that Oriental potentate and pillar of the Christian faith who yearned to come and help the Europeans in the good enterprise of drowning the miscreant Muslims. Okay, so we're going to go into this a little bit, and we're going to see who this really is. The African hypothesis comes from Constantine Marinescu. Prester John, as Marinescu sees him as the monarch of Ethiopia, a land whose conversion to Christianity began in the 4th century, which was later cut off from communication with Europe from the Arab conquest of Egypt and the Sudan. And in spite of this, the Ethiopian isolation, persistent rumors floated westward of a Christian ruler behind the outer fringe of Islam. So basically it goes into these theories, and it says the first identifies Prester John with one person in Asia, and the second makes him a series of sovereigns in Africa. And like I said, because it becomes a title, right, then there are a series of Prester Johns, okay, because it's no longer just the name John Yehochanan, okay? So, moreover, the 1165 letter, the mysterious Christian monarch is made to call himself Presbyter Ioannes. Presbyter Ioannes, which is the equivalent of John the priest. Ethiopia, and apparently Ethiopia alone among the Christian countries, had priest kings in the Middle Ages, which of course Israel had them too, right? Marinescu's case grows stronger still when it's realized that in both Ge'ez and Amharic, the religious and aristocratic languages of that country, the word for king or majesty is one that can be written as Zan or Zian or Yan, and pronounced somewhat like the French Jean or the Italian Gian, both of which stand for John. The chief priest of Ethiopia was therefore also the king or Zan. So the Europeans didn't know anything about the languages and so on. A European writer using Latin would naturally write presbyter Ionis, because I, so the Ya instead of J, right? For the Ethiopian priestly Gian. The Ethiopians and the Hebrews didn't never, so you can always tell the European because of the hard J. Prester is made to utter barbed remarks about the condition of Christianity in Europe and to register doubts about the Western devotion to the faith. His description of himself and of how he wields both temporal and spiritual authority is surely a reference to the destructive conflict between the empire and papacy, then personified by Frederick Barbarossa and Alexander III, which in 1165 had reached a particularly bitter stage. So there's all this conflict in the papacy. And of course that papacy is ESAU, again. Charles V, Holy Roman Empire, later on, that's who that is. Prester's letter would realize that no such thing could happen in his well-ordered dominion. So he's like, we don't have the conflicts, religious conflicts you have. We believe in the Messiah. The picture of unity and harmony prevalent in the vast Prester John Empire seems purposely drawn in contrast to the political chaos of Europe, where kings such as Henry II of England and Louis the, I think this is eighth or something, of France, sorry, I forget the Roman numerals, were constantly at each other's throats. Okay, so he's kind of saying to them, you guys are doing all this fighting, but, we're descendants of David, and we're a unified people. We may be somewhat mixed, but we're following the true faith. And so they considered this as arrogant, right? Because they weren't that knowledgeable about who everybody was. It was Yulitashish, who but a few years earlier had played the desired Prester John role with a vengeance and had shown martial prowess adequate for the work at hand. And since this Asiatic warrior had finished the tangible exploit, it was his memory, however dim and distorted, that the Europeans evoked after when they thought of an Oriental savior. He then was the historical Prester John. The first European mention of him appears in the Chronicle of Otto of Freezing in the year 1145. Otto reports having acquired his information the previous year from a bishop in Gibal in Syria. So that's Assyria. So that's the land of Shem, who had come to Rome to report on church conditions in the Near East. In the Near East. So that's in Assyria, right? Otto was told by this Syrian bishop how not many years earlier, a certain John who lived in the extreme east beyond Persia, so this is far off, and Armenia, and who was both a Nestorian king and a priest, so there we have it again, a king and a priest, had defeated two brothers called Samayadros, who ruled the Persians and the Medes. So this is when the Medes and the Persians were taken down, okay, by the Nestorian king. They were taken over by these two brothers, okay, these Shemitic people, and then the Nestorian king took these two brothers down. He took their capital, Ecbatania, by storm and put vast numbers of their people to the sword. Following the victory, John planned to come to the aid of the church in Jerusalem, but when he reached the Tigris River, he could not cross with his great army. After waiting several seasons in the hope that winter ice would form on the Tigris, while many of his men died of cold, the priest king, so-called Prester John, was compelled to retire eastward. The ruler was a descendant of the biblical Magi, who was a descendant of the biblical Magi, possessed great riches and owned an emerald scepter. So emerald is Yehuda, Judah, right? That's his stone. And his ancestors had been in the custom of making pilgrimages to Jerusalem, and he would have followed their example, but for the unfortunate obstacle of the Tigris. So it says it makes little difference whether Otto received the name Prester John from the Bishop of Gebal or whether he applied it to the Eastern conqueror himself. In either case, it came from the title of Zan of Ethiopia, so John of Ethiopia, whose occasional contacts with Jerusalem had already been noticed. Here's a little footnote here. It says, this is well illustrated by the enthusiasm with which the Crusaders in 1221 greeted the news of Genghis Khan, so now they're calling him Genghis Khan's attack on the Chorezmian Empire in Persia, for they at first took him to be Prester John. Jacques de Vritti wrote Pope Honorius III. All right, so I guess this is the reference here. So now they're saying he was Genghis Khan, okay, which I guess means king. But they say some of it seems quite authentic. Otto gives some authentic details. He locates Prester John's empire with reasonable, if not perfect accuracy, and his time correlation with the actual battle of Katwan is satisfactory. Now, Qatar is east, means east, and so everything up until India, the Ganges or the east area of India, the far area of India, is Kata, which means east. All right. In his mention of the two brothers Samardos, there is a remote but unmistakable reflection of the Seljuk Sultan's name, Sanyar. If Otto had described the vanquished Turkish chieftains as uncle and nephew instead of brothers, he would have been correct, for Sanyar was accompanied into battle by his deceased brother's son. So these are the guys that that Prester John was battling. But the Europeans are assuming they have it right. They don't even know these people. So here's another account of it. The Battle of Katwan was fought between Karakatai and its founder, Yeludashi, and the Seljuk Sultanate led by Sultan Sanyar with his vassal. The Western Karakan Khan Mahmud, only a few years before, Dashi had fled to China with a number of Khitan warriors and their families from the fall of the Khitan Lao dynasty to the Jurchen. So anyway, it just goes into this, and it says Dashi, who Dashi would be Yelu Dashi. That's the same as they're talking about him here as Prester John, or they're calling him, what's the word they use? They use Yelu here as well. So it's basically the same battle. So it's the Karakatai. All right, and it's them battling these two Muslim guys in this Karakan realm. All right, and it says Dashi defeated the Western Karakan Muhammad, who fled to the Seljuk Sultan for aid. Anyway, it says the Dashi's Khitans were well disciplined and followed their lord across Asia, their master, who brought them to victory after the humiliation and quick collapse of. So this is the same battle right here. It's the same battle. It's just it's not going to be accounted for in the same way by Europeans because they don't know the story or the players really. Most of the defeated people settled down quietly to become subjects of the Jurchen, and they refused to accept the yoke and drifted westward in armed bands, seeking new worlds to conquer. So they're going towards the west. They're going towards North America. And then it says, leading one of these Chitan adventure corps was Prince Ye-Lu-Tashi, whom a curious destiny had designed for the role of Prester John. So again, it's this Ye-Lu-Tashi. So in this case, it's like related almost to Tarshish. And then in this one, it's Dashi. So one is Ye-Lu-Tashi and one is Ye-Lu-Dashi. The surrounding Turks in considerable numbers accepted the rule of Ye-Lu-Tashi, who soon held sway over 40,000 families. And it says that this Khitan prince called on the Khitan prince for help against the local enemies, and Tashi, after furnishing the aid, occupied Balagaskun. It says the empire was called Karakate. So like I said, Kara means east. So it's people of the east. It doesn't mean the land is in the east. It means it's people of the east. In Cathay. Okay? Black Cathay. Kara means eastern. You were men of the east. Because India is where the Markur mark means, and Markur means west. So they were west of India in Cathay. Karakate. It could also be the Cathay in America. See, there's a Cathay in America, as we talked about in the videos on Ham and America as the land of Ham. There's a Cathay there, right? And when we talked about all the disasters that had hit, there was a Cathay that was destroyed. But there seems to still be a Cathay in Asia today. So it might have been this one in America when they were connected. All right, so they were Easterners, people of the East, black people of the East in Cathay in the West. It says its ruler bore the title Gur Khan, King of the World. Right, so I think this is saying that he was also called Khan. All right, he was called a king of the world because he was ruling all over the world, because the Europeans were in the dark ages. They were in the ages when black people were ruling everything, and they were just coming up, so they didn't understand the whole world and the history, and it was being hidden from them too. All right. On September 9th at Khitan near Samarkand, all right, it says that Muhammad, commanding a force of 100,000, crossed the Amadara Oxus River. He met with Ye-Lu-Tashish, who led an army reported by the Iraqi historian. Sorry, I read that out of order, guys. I hope I didn't confuse you too much, but I read it out of order. Who led an army reported by the Iraqi historian Ibn al-Athur. So this is an Iraqi historian, and notice his name is very Middle Eastern because he's a Shemite. The Arabs are Shemites. As numbering 300,000 horsemen, details of the battle are lamentably few, but all reports agree that Gur Khan of Karakate won an overwhelming victory. The slaughter was terrific, and they defeated the Turks. Corpses littered the ground for miles. Khitan's sway over Trans-Saxonia was instantly established, and according to Ibn al-Athur, a greater and bloodier defeat of Islam never before happened in Khorasan. The attribution to Ye-Lu-Tashish of 300,000 men 80 years later, Genghis Khan, whose resources greatly exceeded the Gur Khans, Ya-Tashish or Prester John, right? So Genghis Khan's resources greatly exceeded the Gur Khans, but never campaigned with such numbers. Nevertheless, Yelu-Tashi was in some measure a predecessor to the mighty Genghis Khan, and even those Muslim chroniclers who described the later and greater Mongol invasion confessed to the earlier humiliation of their faith at Katwan, so they say, who was a contemporary of the Muslims, and they acknowledged that they had been beaten by him, a remarkable man. And they say this Gur Khan, after all, was no typical Asian marauder. But then they're saying, but a cultured product of Chinese civilization. Well, they're just talking about Asian because Asian is Assyrian and it's assigned to the Shemites, but they're trying to switch the identity. Look up Oriental Studies anywhere, and what comes up is Addis Ababa. What comes up is Ethiopian Studies, because that is the center, the Orient of the world. I remember going to school in the 1990s, and that's when people who were East Indian and Chinese started calling themselves Asians. And they said, you have to call us Asians, you have to call us Asians. They were not called Asians before the 90s. They've been taking over the identity. And as in the management of his own Karakate of Prester John, he exercised special care in the appointment of officials to rule the people, and he refused to parcel land out as fiefs to his relatives or friends. Injustice and drunkenness he severely reproved. In 1007, the powerful Mongol tribes of the Karaites was baptized in mass in the Nestorian faith. Now, Karaites, there are Karaite Jews. Remember, we talked about Judas Iscariot. Although Karakatay Empire lasted for several generations, none of the succeeding Gurkhans, see, they're calling him a Prester John, a Khan, a king, because that's what they call them in that realm. Even though he was a Prester or he was a Hebrew, he was an Ethiopian, that's what they called him in that land where he was ruling, because that was the land of Canaan and Khan, right? So that's what they called their rulers. And their dominion shrank in size and its importance until its final absorption into Genghis Khan's empire in 1218. So Archbishop Christian Mance recalled Yelu-Tashish as a veritable hammer of Islam. Okay, so when you're talking about these African warriors, they're warriors, you know, just because they believe in their concept of Christ was not the same. They saw Christ as coming as a warrior, not like the Christians see it in, you know, with soft blonde hair and looking a little, you know, kind of transgender and all that stuff. That's not how they saw him, because they saw him like David, who was both a warrior and a priest. So they were warriors and priests. He described the Prester's empire as a polyglot affair composed of different peoples and religious faiths, where in spite of all differences, justice and contentment existed. All right, the Gur Khan's real empire was indeed polyglot, containing Buddhists, possibly Confucianists, Muslims, Nestorians, Jews, Manichaeans, and Shamanists. So it says, to the Europeans who learned this agreeable news about his victory in Karakatan against the Muslims, right? During a low moment in the Crusades, it could only mean that Prester John had gone into action at last. The impressions of the Gur Khan's character and personality, bearing some approximation to the truth despite distortions, likewise drifted into Europe, so that Yelu-Tashish, his little known and greatly misunderstood life, became the nucleus of all that was vital in the Prester John story. And Prester John was neither overlooked nor forgotten, and for nearly 4 centuries thereafter, the adventurous sons of Europe roamed the earth in search of him. The story of him conquering those lands and heading into the West and being in the ESAU, Edom, being in the empire of the East of Ham, along with the 10 tribes, But how was the switch made to beast mode from Prester John in Tartaria? Well, let's get into it. Indeed, it is very likely that some sort of identification between Prester John and the King of Israel, between this remote realm of Christians and the final refuge of the lost 10 tribes, lies buried in the very sources of this legend. This possibly seems very close to the surface in the early Central Asian version provided by Hugh of Jabala, with its intimations of Tartars and of the king of the KAZARS. Only a generation after Bishop Hugh, the celebrated Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela described a relationship he had heard about between 4 lost tribes and a nomadic people called the Kofar al-Tarak in the Central Asian steppes. The Kofar al-Tarak evidently were not Christians, but their purported relationship with some of the lost tribes resembles that of Prester John and could have something to do with the making of the latter's legend. So the reason why I'm showing this to you is because the KAZARS, the Tartars, have a story of the myth of the god Arabi. And I was on one of those channels that deals with the mud floods and the Russian history of the KAZARS. Were they this great kingdom? And you see there's a mix of people here, right? 3 Caucasians, and then you see more blackish, and this guy looks more Asian here in the back, East Indian, Asian. This guy looks like a mix, right? And he's wearing the Isaurian feathers around his head. These people are looking more sort of Asian in their headdresses, so they're wearing more like kind of East Indian looking or Kushite, Hamitic looking head garb. These guys have got the Isaurian eagle feathers on their heads as well, okay? And so this is one of the descendants of Menelik here. And you see he's got the cross, he's got the Southern Cross, even though they're looking kind of Arabic at the same time. It's a combination between, Christian and Arab. It's a mixed multitude. But I wanted to point out that they have this whole myth of the god Arabi, who brought them out of all of their poverty and brought them out of their ignorance. That's kind of what Ivan van Sertima just described that the Africans did to the Europeans. So here is the final descendant of Menelik. This guy is described as a Menelik. Okay, so we see he does look part black, right? And a lot of these people are looking very Caucasian or mixed with East Indian. They're dark nonetheless, and some of them are light. So these are Khazarians. This is more the mixed multitude. On the left, we see a descendant of the far north black settlers. Okay, and so his body is looking kind of a little bit crunched up and small, maybe starvation or just maybe bad genetics. But that is a descendant of the lost tribes on the left. Here we have one of the black Abkhazian tribes from that same region, and this is from the 1800s. So could it be Ab, father of the set apart Zion, or father of the Khazarians? All right, could this be a descendant of the god Arabi? So if anyone has any information, that channel took down the video because I put a comment saying, this means you're a descendant of the black Arabs, right? And the video was gone. So I couldn't find the source, but if anyone knows, please let me know. This is from Prester John the Legend and its sources. And so we're going to get into the beasts of no nation, and we'll go into them later too in another part of the series. But the advent of the Mongols in the early 13th century changed European perceptions of the world indelibly. No longer was Europe characterized by an internal struggle with the Saracen. Now European leaders, both secular and ecclesiastical, began to realize the danger and potential that Asia presented. Okay, so no longer were they contending with the Arabs, but now there was the new threat of the Mongols. In recognition of this, many missionaries were sent eastwards with the charge of converting the Mongol Khans and gathering information about the threat they posed. And Prester John features in a number of these accounts, and for the first time, a number of European writers began to wonder whether his fame was justly deserved. Okay, so, you know. What I want to do is start off with the kind of incident that is described twice in this book of the conflict, you know, Prester John ruling the Mongol tribes and their locations both what we know as Eastern Europe and in North America, ruling them in both of those places. And one of the conflicts that kind of kicked off his challenges with them. But first of all, there's this prophecy that a king would come from the western region who would destroy the Saracens up to Jerusalem. And then the Prester John story that enters into that is that there was a writing from the overseas regions that King David, who is called Prester John, a God-fearing man, having passed Persia into his powerful hand. So he had overcome Persia. Okay, and he was ruling it. See down here, he was in a battle against the Medes and Persians, and he called the Tartars to his aid. Okay, that's what happened. And he proceeded far from that region, and his army extended for 10 days from Baghdad and that most great and city, which the special seat of the Caliph was, and the Saracens, whom the Saracens call their highest priest. Now remember, in 700 BC, a Prester John, a Isaurian, took over Assyria and orchestrated the Assyrian captivity of the 10 tribes, and he took over Persia. So is that the same person? Are they jumbling history? Is this an extension of that rulership? So he ended up with this kingdom, and there were roughly 300 cities, 66 flowing rivers into 4 parts. He had set up 100,000 fighters in each part, and his son had now come into that region. The same King David or his son. Now a lot of people believe that it's his son, okay? To Cumania, which is beyond Hungary and in the Russian parts. And there he destroyed certain lands of unbelievers, especially the Cuman, and he held the strongest war there for 5 months, with the Russians resisting him in many thousands, and likewise the Prussian pagans, whom he killed without number. And then this region was destroyed. A lot of this stuff we're not really familiar with unless you live in those areas, but this, suffice to say, shows you the incredible things that were said about him and how he defeated the Saracens and the Persian. It says now here, just skipping forwards, and this is about 1222 AD, King David and his army, which the Hungarians and Cumans call the Tartars, so that was his army. He had an army of Tartars. Up until now, their followers in the overseas part were known as Tartar. So the overseas part, I believe, is North America, okay? And when they heard that Damietta had been ruined, they returned through the islands of the sea to their fatherlands as much as they were able, and all their fame was scattered and vanished in a short time. And so when we're talking about these Tartarians, we are talking, I've shown you in the videos, about the 7 nations, the Septimus Severus, the severed nations who were set apart behind the wall. So this wasn't Gentiles, because when you're talking about KAZARS and Canaanites and all this stuff, you're talking about the other seed, the mixed seed. And this becomes a big issue with Prester John because it seems that he's an Ethiopian. So this would make him a descendant of David, okay, maybe mixed in with the Hamites a little bit. So the Tartars lived in North Chiorkia. In this country, there were great plains that did not have dwellings like cities and castles, but there were good pastures and plenty of rivers and lakes, and they did not have lords, but certainly paid tax to one great lord who was called in their language Unk Khan, or On Khan, okay? which means in French the great lord, and this was Prester John, of whose kingdom everyone speaks. And the Tartars paid him a tax of 1 animal for every 10, and now it happened that they multiplied greatly. And when Prester John saw that there was such a great people, he said that they could harm him, and he said that he would disperse them throughout many lands. And so he sent one of his barons there to do this. And when the Tartars heard what Prester John wanted to do to them, they became sad, and they all departed together and headed for the desert towards the north, where Prester John could not harm them. And they rejoiced because they no longer had to pay him any tax. Okay, so this is the beginning of the conflict. And there became such a great multitude of Tartars, quote, that it was marvelous. And when King Genghis Khan saw that he had such great people, he prepared them with bow and other weapons and went conquering through certain regions. I tell you, they easily conquered 8 provinces, but he would not do anything bad to them. But he took with him to conquer them with him to conquer other peoples. And this way he conquered a great multitude of people, as you have heard. And this people, when they saw the good kingdom and greatness of that Lord, a great number of them willingly rallied to him. And Genghis Khan had amassed such a great multitude of people which covered the whole world, he said he wished to conquer a great part of the world. Then he sent messengers to Prester John, and this was in the year of 1200 from the birth of Christ, and he sent word to him that he wanted Prester John to give him his daughter as a wife. And when Prester John heard that Genghis Khan ordered him to give his daughter as a wife, he was greatly outraged, and he said, "How can Genghis Khan ask my daughter as a wife without great shame? Does he not realize that he is my vessel and my servant? Go back and tell him that I would rather give my daughter to be burned than to give her to him as my wife, and tell him on my behalf I ought to put him to death if he acts like a traitor and a villain against his Lord." And he told the messengers to depart immediately from his presence and never return. And when the messengers heard this, they immediately departed. They went so far that they came to their Lord, and they told him everything that Prester John had said, omitting nothing, all in order. And when Genghis Khan heard the great dishonor that Prester John had done him, his heart was so inflamed and almost burnt from his breast. And he was a man of great power. In brief silence, he proclaimed in a voice so loud that every bystander could hear it, that he would on no account retain his sovereignty if the insult that Prester John had done him did not cost its maker dearer than any insult ever cost any man. And he said he would soon show him that Prester John was in fact his vassal. And so he brought all his people together and made a great army, which had never been seen or heard of. So there's a lot of embellishment here. And he informed Prester John that he was coming against him with all his forces so that he could defend himself as best he could. And when Prester John knew for certain that Genghis Khan was coming against him with such great people, he mocked it, but nevertheless he said to himself inwardly that he would do everything in his power to take him. Remember now, these are the 7 nations. These are the people that Torah says do not marry, do make no agreements with them, and utterly destroy them. And so these are the Canaanites. And what we see, I think, in this image is one of Menelek's final descendants that arise from this conflict, because according to Scripture, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. So they're thinking, if you're really a Christian, we should be able to intermarry with you. But Torah says differently, right? So Genghis Khan decides to go to war against them. Because of this scripture in Jeremiah, it's kind of down in his favor. Thus says Yahua, I will sow the house of Yasharal and the house of Yehuda with the seed of man and the seed of beast. Beasts of no nation. Genghis Khan saw that he was going to win the war through some kind of divination. And because he found the Christians to be truthful, he then did great honor to the Christians and always held them to be truthful and reliable men. And the proceedings of the great battle which took place between John and... But basically they armed themselves and fought each other bitterly. The battle was so great that it was like, and none other seen before. Heavy losses were sustained on both sides, but Genghis Khan won the battle. And in this battle, Prester John was killed. And this is supposed to actually be the son of Prester John. And from that day, Genghis Khan was constantly attacking the land which he held before he died. And I say to you that Genghis Khan reigned for 6 years after this battle and conquered many castles and many provinces. But at the end of these 6 years, he went to a castle called Kagan, where he was wounded by an arrow and he was killed. What I want to add was that he did take the daughter, and the daughter wound up being very renowned. And this is the thing, is that some of the stories are a bit mixed up. And so here it is with the same story of hearing the unexpected coming of Genghis Khan. Everyone is massacred, and the surviving daughter, Genghis Khan, took to wife. And so what they don't understand, the Khans, they're Canaanites, is that they're not supposed to mix with King Solomon's blood, that the Hebrews, the Yehudi, do not mix with the Canaanites. It's all through law. That's why it says, do not marry, make no agreements with them, and utterly destroy them. Okay, so, but what he does is he marries the youngest of Toghrul's younger brother, the youngest daughter of Toghrul's younger brother, who was married off to Genghis Khan's son Tuli, and she was a Nestorian Christian and later became one of the most influential women in the Mongol political structure. Now, there's kind of two stories in this book, like I said, but I think they've conflated and mixed up the two. But that's the story, and I'm just telling you the reason why he would reject a mongrel sleeping with his, because they're mixed with fallen angel seed. So watch this video to find out more. Do not marry, make no agreements with them, utterly destroy. That is the story of the beginning of Genghis Khan. And you could see from that slide that I showed you guys that it says from there, this is why I say beast with no nation, Rome was picked apart and divided even more by 10 barbarian tribes, which became 10 countries. The 10 toes, the 10 nations of the beast, the fourth beast. Okay? And I believe this is, and we'll get into this a little later, but I believe that this is what happened in America and in Europe. I think a lot of Rome and possibly Greece was also in America. The Canaanites were given Ham's land, but there's some of these people, like the people of Mount Seir and the Horites and stuff, who have no genealogy at all, coming from Og of Bashan. And you've heard me quote Og in this. So there's these people, the scripture says in Job, dead things come up from out of the sea and the inhabitants thereof. So this is the rise of those nations from under the earth, from the ball earth, from the earth that comes up from beneath the waters and begins to rule on the surface of the earth. That's what this is really talking about. That's who these people are. Septimus Severus, the 7-nation army. And we're going to find out that this is, this is who, as we talked about, this is who the 10 tribes have been fighting against in their scattering. The 7 nations. This whole identity theft by Esau Edom in the form of Prester John transitioning from Israel's rulership had to be hidden. And that's why there's this whole Prester John mystery. The roped off Europeans needed to hide him. And all of this if they were to take over the identity of Israel and to hide the vastness and the extent of the empire of the Hebrews and their offspring and the other nations they mixed in with. But as well, there is a kind of a mystery behind the hidden left hand. Don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing. So Israel is the right hand, Esau is the left hand. And then the Gentiles become the right hand, and Esau is still the left hand. So HaSatan is the left hand. That's why in a lot of the images that you see of, for example, those Egyptian ones I show you, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, everyone's got a left hand, because this is the time that HaSatan is ruling. And so Esau does what HaSatan does. He rules secretly. And so this is, to a degree, a strategy that is having a particular long-term historical effect in the future. And it's the beginning of it. But these are also the real things that are going on. And the Europeans are ignorant. They don't know about Africa or the East. They just don't, because it was completely hidden from them so they could build Babylon later and say they discovered it and it was the new land, and make them think, as so many do who live in North America now, that this isn't Egypt. Okay? So that was the whole intent behind it. And that's why they wanted to use the Europeans, because they were so ignorant of history. Now, I'm not talking about like the Midianites or Tarshish, for example. But when you talk about the people way up north, yes, they were. Now, the Ionians, the Romans, the Midianites, the ships of Tarshish, these people were not ignorant. However, when we look at the whole Septimus Severus, the 7 nations question, these are totally ignorant because they were cast aside and removed from the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth and hidden up in the north and actually walled away. So they were in a state of great deprivation and depravity. And so when you hear these descriptions of the state they were in, it's quite alarming. And so then they become the perfect device of ignorance to build a new culture and society off of. They were the cutters of wood and the carriers of water, and they came up. They were the dead things that came up from the sea, according to Job, the RAPHAIM. Hebrews in America say this was their big come up from under the sea. So this is from Arthur Koestler's 13th tribe. And so these are the Mores, the sexual mores of the goose. So these are some of the tribes in the area of Kazaria. And this is how the Arabs are describing them. The Goose Turks, who pay tribute to the KAZARS and, according to some sources, were closely related to them. So it talks about how they live in tents and move on and have nomadic customs. There is a remarkable mixture of liberalism and savagery. The women wear no veils in the presence of men or stranger, nor do the women cover any parts of their bodies in the presence of people. One day we stayed at a place in Goose and were sitting around on the ground, and his wife also was present, and we conversed with him. And the woman uncovered her private parts and scratched them, and we all saw it. And thereupon we covered our faces and said, "May God forgive me." And the husband laughed and said to the interpreter, "Tell him we uncover it in your presence so that you may see and restrain yourselves, but it cannot be attained. This is better than when it is covered up and yet unattainable. Adultery is alien to them. Yet when they discover that someone is an adulterer, they split him in 2 halves, and this they do by bringing together the branches of 2 trees, tie him to the branches, and then let both trees go so that the man is torn in 2. As for homosexuality, in which Arab countries was taken as a matter of course, and of course that is very true, they practice pedophilia. You see that in Beasts of No Nation with Idris Elba. Idris Elba is an Edomite. And Fuldan says that it is regarded by the Turks as a terrible sin, but in the only episode he relates to prove his point, the seducer of a beardless youth gets away with a fine of 400 sheep. Accustomed to the splendid baths of Baghdad, our traveler could not get over the dirtiness of the Turks. The Goose do not wash themselves after defecating or urinating, nor do they bathe after seminal pollution or on other occasions. They refused to have anything to do with water, particularly in winter. When the Goose commander-in-chief took off his luxurious coat of brocade to don a new coat the mission had brought him, they saw his underclothes were falling apart from dirt, for their custom never to take off the garment they wear close to their bodies until it disintegrates. So they don't take off their undergarments until they disintegrate. Another Turkish tribe, the Bashkirs, shave their beards and eat their lice, and they search the folds of their undergarments and crack the lice with their teeth. When Ibn Faldan watched as a Bashkir do this, the latter remarked to him, "They are delicious." All in all, it's not an engaging picture. Our fastidious travelers' contempt for the barbarians was profound, but it was only aroused by their uncleanliness and what he considered as indecent exposure of the body. Another thing I want to show you in this book is regarding the 13th tribe. After the Holy Muslim War, the caliphate was rocked by dissensions, The KAZARS became more powerful than they had previously been around 740 AD. His court and military ruling class embraced the Jewish faith, and Judaism became the state religion of the KAZARS. No doubt their contemporaries were as astonished by the decision as modern scholars. So they converted, right? And this is what a Jew, Arthur Koestler, is saying. Their contemporaries were as astonished by the decision as modern scholars were when they came across the evidence of the Arab, Byzantine, Russian, and Hebrew sources. One of the most recent comments is to be found in the work by Hungarian Marxist historian Dr. Antal Barth. His book on the Magyar society in the 8th and 9th centuries has several chapters on the KAZARS, as during most of that period the Hungarians were ruled by them. Yet their conversion to Judaism is discussed in a single paragraph with obvious embarrassment. It reads, "Our investigations cannot go into the problems pertaining to the history of ideas, but we must call the reader's attention to the matter of the Khazar kingdom state religion. It was the Jewish faith which became the official religion of the ruling strata of the society. Needless to say, the acceptance of the Jewish faith as a state religion of an ethnically non-Jewish people could be the subject of interesting speculations. We shall, however, confine ourselves to the remark that this official conversion, in defiance of Christian proselytizing by the Byzantium and Muslim influence from the East, and in spite of political pressure of these two powers to a religion which had no support from any political power, in other words, a religion which had no support from any political power, but was persecuted by nearly all, has come as a surprise to all historians concerned with the KAZARS, and cannot be considered as accidental, but must be regarded as a sign of the independent policy pursued by that kingdom." In other words, it was very deliberate and calculated. Okay? 1973 edition of Encyclopedia Judacia, the article KAZARS is signed by Dunlop, but there is a separate section dealing with the Khazar Jews after the fall of the kingdom, signed by the editors, written with obvious intent to avoid upsetting believers in the dogma of the chosen race. The Turkish-speaking Karaites, remember Judas Iscariot, and he did very much mix in with various groups of people, a fundamentalist Jewish sect of Crimea, Poland, and elsewhere, have affirmed a connection with the KAZARS, which is perhaps confirmed by evidence from folklore and anthropology as well as language. There seems to be a considerable amount of evidence attesting to the continued presence of the descendants of the KAZARS. How important in quantitative terms is the presence of the Caucasian sons of Japheth and the tents of Shem? One of the most, so that's the prophecy, right? Most radical proponents of the hypothesis concerning the Khazar origins of Jewry is the professor of medieval Jewish history at Tel Aviv. His book Tartaria was published in 1944. A new approach both to the problem of relations between the Khazar Jewry and other Jewish communities and to the question of how far can we go in regarding the Khazar Jewry as the nucleus of the large Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe, descendants of this settlement who stayed where they were, who immigrated to the United States and to other countries, and who went to Israel, constitute now the large majority of the world of Jewry. In other words, they've never been anywhere but in Northern Europe and in the United States, and now they're in Israel. Never in Africa, never anywhere else. It means that their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from Volga, not from Canaan, but from Caucasus, once believed to be the cradle of the Aryan race, that genetically they are most closely related to the Hun. So the Hun are a mixture between Canaanites and Japhethites, right? Showed that in previous videos. Attila was, after all, merely a king of a kingdom of tents. His state passed away. The Hun state was a whirlwind. And this is most important, the last thing. Lastly, the Arab geographer Ishtakhari, one of the main Arab resources, has this to say: the Khazars do not resemble the Turks. They are black-haired and are of two kinds. One called the Kara Khazars. So remember I went to the Karaite Jews, and the Kara, who are Edomites, and they are black. the KAZARS, the black KAZARS, who were swarthy. Swarthy means black-skinned or brown-skinned, verging on deep black, see, as they were a kind of Indian, and a white kind, KAZARS. Ak means west, right, or brother, who are strikingly handsome. Okay, so black KAZARS. You see, again, the Hebrews are black, mixing in with them. This is Esau, Edom, the KAZARS, mixing in. Okay? And then they dump on you this whole mythology about how lower classes were black, called black Bulgars, and upper classes white Bulgars, and it had nothing to do with skin. Really? And then they say that it was a myth that blacks were there. It is important to realize here that Esau and the serpent people of Tartaria originate Masonry. The cradle of the symbolism used in all Masonry is placed by many of the best authorities in that country which they believe was first inhabited, i.e. the plateau of Tartaria, and from there transmitted to this generation by the sages of India, Persia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. We are not indebted to either ancient Egypt for either religion or masonry, but to America. This is the Khazarian connection. So this conspiracy to hide this history is reflected in this CIA document that exposes what the Communist Party did to cover up the true history of Tartaria and to proceed with a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria and liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, it was to be the history of the Tartarians was rewritten and falsified in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians on the orders of the Communist Party have rewritten history to distort the facts so that Russians appear to always be in a good light. Now, that's not true. And future generations of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts about their nation's past. Well, that's not entirely true. What it's about is it's about hiding Prester John and that transition of the identity of Israel and the Jews and the transition of Black Esau to white Europe and the Black Empire to the white empire. Because this is literally the transition point in place. So it's not just about, oh, we don't want to make Russians look bad. Because there's the Czars in this case, there's the whole family of the Byzantines, there's there's Ivan the Terrible and his family line, there's obviously I've already mentioned that the KAZARS taking on that Jewish identity. And there's Genghis Khan and the transition of the Ethiopians running those empires to now the Mongols and the Asians taking on the identity of Israel. That's a lot of stuff to cover up. It's not just about communism. So after the Mongols horde takes over Europe and transitions their identity there, the West is mythologized into this kind of distant utopia, this unknown land, as the transition into Western Europe begins and the destruction of the old Egypt or West takes place. Now, something that is also related is this story of Nehemiah Theodoric in 775 AD. He reconquers the American empire of Kalalas. Okay, so Theodoric, you know that's two doors. You know that Nehemiah, these are Ethiopians. Okay, and so he reconquers the empire of Kalalas, and which was ruled by Silvanus Toltecus. So this is the Toltecs. Silvanus meaning a Solomon. And remember I told you these are titles. This is an actual King Solomon. This is 775 AD. This is the time of the Assyrian captivity when the 10 tribes were taken captive. And they're saying this is the hereditary ruler of the former Jewish Roman colony. So now when you're talking about Jewish people, you're talking about Edomites after the time of Esther, right? And that's when the ESAUians began to call themselves Jews. All right. And so that here, the most important thing to realize is that this great ruler of Sumeria, right? A great Roman Jewish ruler, so we're talking Edomite, an ancestor of the Swanites, Barbar-Katsans. When you talk about Barbar, usually talking about Edomites and barbarians, or a mix thereof. He also had a fleet of trading vessels known as the ships of Solomon, or the swan boats. So here Esau is mimicking the journeys and kingdoms that the Israelites had. And this is the ships of Solomon, or the 7 swan boats they talk about. So Septimus 7 nations, right? The 7 nations that are not of the seed of Adam, the seed of Yah. Anyway, so he took these trading vessels, and the ships are shaped like a swan with sails like the wings of beautiful gliding white swan. And so they sail after the defeat of Silvanus Toltesius, a member of the royal family, were sent back to Europe, where they were under the protection of Nehemiah Theodorus and his family. And the legend of Dun and Ogier are based on the activities of this family, descended from Duan, Tugon, Ogier, and Silvanus Bravo. And anyway, so it goes into the legends, and this is connected to the giant ogre heads of the Olmec, where they are found. And also, when you're talking about Og, you're talking about Og of Bashan. When you're talking about ogres, you're talking about giants. The descendants of giants are moving into Europe, and they've been brought there by Esau. Now, the Toltecs were related to the Shemites who are in South America, but this is some other kind of mixed breed with fallen seed that is being brought back to Europe. And the land is being cleaned up of those people. And those people are being emigrated to other lands. This is the transitional stage via these ships. Like I said, the swan is tied to Zeus and the rape of Lucretia, so creating this fallen angel seed out of mixing with the blood of women. Okay? In Lost Tribes and Promised Lands, it talks about the Near East and Far East. All right, I've read this many times. First verse of the book of Esther describes the realm of the Persian king Ahasuerus, whose place was also at Susa, extending from India even unto Ethiopia. So India and Ethiopia can be interchanged, although Ethiopia is more mixed, more so with Shem. And Ahasuerus is Esau, and the Assyrians, the Shemitic Assyrians from Persia, who had very much mixed in with this religion of the giants. And they also talk about the apocryphal Acts of St. Thomas and the apostle moving easily between Persia and India. And then it talks about down here, it says, in each of the 3 Indias, who describe exploits of the apostle Thomas and Matthew. And the concept was more standard in one of the Middle Ages, that one of the 3 Indias faced Ethiopia. The second one faced Persia. The third occupied the ends of the earth between the ocean and the realm of darkness. So there was a lot of descriptions of Amazons and people in the west and the Fortunate Islands, and how Cathay land was defined, because remember in the other videos I talk about how it was destroyed, because it talks about the Cathay land map proves that the Madeira Islands were known well to Abraham and Jesuda Cress, and a handful of sailors lost to history. All right. So, And this principate, this is describing the land of Prester John, or one of his principates, extends from Ethiopia to Black Cathay, whence it is called Karakathea or Karakatai. And Kara is the same as black, and it is called Black Cathay to differentiate it from the other Cathay that is far beyond it towards the east. Many regions distant from that Black Cathay, which will be described later on, and this land, along with the lands adjacent to it, is a special land of the Emperor of the Tartars. He always roams around it with his court, ascending in summer to cold regions, and in winter descending to hot. And this Black Cathay was the land of Prester John, or King John, about whom there was accustomed to be such a great rumor, and about whom many false things have been written and said. So it says that it is towards the east, and then it says it's distant from the other Cathay that is far beyond it towards the east. So they must be talking about the one in North America. It says Cathay. Remember, I told you that there were lands of Cathay that were destroyed in the west. So there were two Cathays, all right? Tibet, Gallia, Sing. So when we pull out, this is where we were. Okay? So this is North America. This is America. And then this is what we'd so-called Canada, right? And so they were fighting with the 7 nations here, the giants, Kayamba, Manji, Tibet, Kayambra, Gala, Ban, Kathaya, Karia, like Korea, or Kariite Jews, right? This is America. This is America. This is where the tribes were scattered to. There's even land up here called Caruso, up north here. At a place south of Egypt on the Kakan land map, a Sarsaarian king is described as being always at war with the Christians of Nubia, who are under the rule of the Emperor of Ethiopia of the land of Prester John. So Sarsaarian, here it says, Hugh's story may have been based on the exploits of an actual Tartar king. The Tartars were often in contact with the far-flung Nestorian communities of Central Asia and had shown an interest in Christianity from time to time. The idea that they might be descended from the lost tribes of Israel helped to encourage the dream that they would one day see light and convert to Christianity and form the other jaw of the great Christian pincer movement against Islam. So they wanted to squash Islam from both the Western side and the other side. It says Europeans evidently thought, well, wait a minute. And of course, the example of a mass conversion in the Central Asian steppes had been provided by the KAZARS. Many Europeans evidently thought this had been a conversion to Christianity. So here it is again, the KAZARS converted to Judaism. It was a conversion. They weren't the original people. They weren't the Yahudi, the Jews, right? They weren't Israel. Later on, there was to be a widespread but mistaken belief that Genghis Khan had become a Christian. The Tartar version of the legend was still strong enough in the late 13th century for Marco Polo to assume that a neighboring prince had heard about while in Cathay was Prester John. John claims to have exceeded all men in riches, virtue, and power. When he rides forth into war, he's accompanied by more than 100,000 cavalrymen and more than 1 million soldiers, marching beyond 13 enormous crosses made of gold and precious stones. 72 kings pay tribute to him. 30,000 men eat at his table every day, and they are served by 7 kings, 52 dukes, and 365 counts. Okay, you're talking about dukes, these are the dukes of Edom. Anytime you're talking about dukes, you're talking about Esau, Edom. You're talking about the dukes of Edom. Because we know that when the transition did happen, they were together. Esau and Israel had let Edom in. Kings of dukes descended of his sons, and the dukes of Seir and the Horite kings of Edom dukes. Okay, dukes of Edom. So here's the dukes. Timnah, Duke Aliyah. Does that sound Muslim? All right, so they were known as the dukes. Okay, so when you hear dukes, you're hearing about Esau, Edom. 52 dukes and 365 counts, as well as a humbler retinue. Roman and Greek clergymen alike eat at John's side. So this is Japheth's land of the Greek, and look at all the Greek architecture. This is Japheth and Israel are the Greeks, and Esau and Chittim are the Romans. Okay, so there's always kind of a mixing going on with Japheth. Japheth is mixing in with Shem, whether it's Esau or Israel, right? So the Greeks were a mix of the 10 tribes. So what are all these Greeks and Romans and all these people doing? Well, everybody's shifting over to Europe and abandoning this land, and it's being cleaned up and set up for Babylon. And so that history that was there is being hidden, because if this was truly the West, maybe Greece and Rome were here. Here's the account of them hiding the northland of Japheth in the west. They sometimes passed laws for the inflicting of the severest punishment upon citizens who should reveal to the outside world the locations, nature, or extent or value of their possessions. Ancient book called the Book of Wonders, ascribed to Aristotle, contains the following. When the Carthaginians, who were masters of the Western Ocean, observed that many traders and other men attracted by the fertility of the soil and pleasant climate had fixed their houses, they feared that the knowledge of this land should reach other nations. A great concourse to it of men from various lands of the earth would follow, that the conditions of life then so happy on that island would not only be unfavorably affected, but the Carthaginian Empire itself would suffer injury, and the domination of the sea be wrestled from their hands. So this is Aegeus. These are the Cushites, okay? And these are the Carthaginians, or the Cushites. Jasher 74:3, and when Baal-Canaan, son of Akbor, reigned over Edom, all the children of drew their allegiance from Edom. And it was after the death of Asdrubal, son of Angeas, when Latin had turned back to his land from the battle, that all the inhabitants of Africa rose up and took Annibal, the son of Aegeus, the younger brother of Asdrubal, and made him king instead of his brother over the whole land of Africa. And Annibal smote the children of Chittim. So these are the Cushites. And so this is Hannibal protecting America, the land of the Cushites, from the West, and going into an agreement and allegiance with Rome and all the Greeks and everything, because they're going to hide the West for the building up of Babylon. So they basically, for about 500 years, they're just secretly all hiding out there. They're telling you that that little bitty place called Greece in the Mediterranean is Greece, is the land of Japheth and the north, when it's really Shem's land. And this Japheth and Ham's land over here are vast. Priests of On in Toronto and Ontario. And in Jasher, there's all these scrimmages between the Hamites and the Japhethites, because they're right next door to each other. They're right across the street from each other, right across the border from each other. So they issued a decree that no one under penalty of death should therefore after sail thither. So the island is Turtle Island. This passage is quoted not merely to claim that it refers to the continent of America, but for the purpose, so that's America, of showing how carefully the Phoenicians, remember that's Esau, Phoenician people, whether Asiatic, Carthaginian, or Spanish, guarded from the great world. So that includes the Spaniards. Okay? That means we're going to find out. Charles V guarded from the great world the foreign discoveries which they had made, where their kindred were enjoying prosperity, and to enable us to see how likely their discoveries would be to come to the knowledge of the great mass of humankind. Let us look to the moment for some of the things which the ancient Greek and Latin authors have said, indicating their knowledge of the existence of the Western continent. Crates, a commentator on Homer, is quoted by Strabo before Christ as saying that Homer means in his account of the Western Ethiopians. The Western Ethiopians. Shem's land is in the east and the south, not the west, but these are the Western Ethiopians, the inhabitants of the Atlantis or Hesperides, as the unknown world of the west was then variously called. Pliny locates the Western Ethiopians somewhere in the Atlantic. This shows that the Crates and Pliny believed that the great poet Homer believed in the existence of the great continent on the western shore of the Atlantic Ocean. Plato says the sea, the west indeed navigatable, and had an island fronting the mouth, which in your tongue you call the Pillars of Hercules. Again, Atlantis was in front of the Pillars of Hercules. In front of the Pillars of Hercules. That's at 33 degrees. And this island is larger than Libya and Asia put together, and there is a passage hence for travelers of that day to the rest of the islands, as well as from those islands to the whole opposite continent that surrounds the sea. So you see, they all knew about it, and they were all just hiding it until it was time to build up Babylon. So back to lost tribes. They eat at John's side. The table itself is made of emerald and supported by legs of amethyst. Other tables in the place are of gold and ivory. The palace is built after the pattern of the one erected for King Gundafor by the Apostle Thomas. It is a vast structure of shittim wood. So that's what shittim wood is, what the Ark of the Covenant is made out of. Ebony gold. So ebony, onyx, sardonyx, and crystal. These are all the stones that are part of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Amethyst and emerald. John's bedchamber is bedecked with gold and precious stones, and his bed is made of sapphire. There's another one. So those are all the 12, a lot of the 12 tribe stones. But the sapphire represents chastity, and though John has a harem of the most beautiful women in the world, he lies with one or another of them only 4 times a year solely for procreation. Well, that's polygamy. Well, you see, this is just a picture of Prester John dining on the 10 tribes. His table is made out of all of their precious stones of priesthood and tribes. This is a table prepared for him in the presence of his enemies. Okay, he has an ideal balance of wealth and wisdom that characterizes the realm over which he presides, and there's no poverty among his subjects. Ethiopia, utopia. Utopia. Remember, the Greeks and the Romans decided to hide the West, right? So they're out there enjoying it while the rest of the world knows nothing about it. So what does Oriental Masonry say? America Atlantis, and is the curtain which has hitherto concealed the prehistoric connection between the peoples of ancient Egypt and of America is lifted, and it will be seen that the people of the Eagle on the Nile, that is, priests of On in Cairo, the Edomites of the Eagle on the Nile, the Egyptians in Africa, being descended from the original people of the eagle on the continent, the twain, the two are one, and the prehistoric America was the original Egypt or Eagle Land. There's this whole thing about Prester John and the Fountain of Youth, but I think it's really tied to adrenochrome and the offering, and I'm going to do a whole other video on that. Rock that has curative powers. Two holy men guard it and ask every arriving pilgrim if he is Christian or wants to become one. If he answers affirmatively, he's allowed to get into the muscle-shaped cavity of the rock within or 4 inches of water, and if the pilgrim's faith is sincere, the water will rise miraculously above his head 3 times, and he will be cured of any ailment. So this is the whole Fountain of Youth thing. He describes himself and his realm. The presbyter, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So you see, he's calling himself King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is Esau's Christ. Again, Prester John, the legend and its sources says Prester John, master of masters, like master masonry. So this is a type of Hashatan. Prester John the Red is what he's called in this book. Prester John was known as King of Kings and Lord of Lords of the earth by the power and virtue of God, our Lord Jesus Christ, to Emmanuel, governor of the Romans, health, and so on. See how there is a connection to the Romans, right? The Holy Roman Empire, here, right here, excelling every king of the whole earth in virtue and power. 72 kings are tributaries to us because there are many Christians, and etc., and so on, which continues up to, we also have another palace which was made through the revelation to my father, who was called quasi-deus, godlike. All right, like Quetzalcoatl, quasi-godlike, Katal Allah. And so that's from page 146. And so when we look up Lord, Lord means Baal. And throughout scripture, they've replaced Yahua with Baal. Okay? It's a Northwest Semitic title and honorific, meaning owner. It's not honorific. It means owner, master, or lord, wrathful charmer, schemer, creditor, dreamer, husband, bird, predatory bird like an eagle, or archer. Okay, so the archer is one who slings arrows like the enemy. Satan sends you slings and arrows. That is used for various G-gods who were patrons of cities in the Levant and Asia Minor. Cognate to Akkadian Belu, a Baalist. A Baalite means a worshiper of Baal. Okay? Hosea, my Baal, a reference to the divine name used in the northern kingdom. Here for the first time forbidden. So we know the northern kingdom, right? Ephraim and Dan and HARAM ABIFF got seduced by the Canaanites, and so they were worshiping Baal. So would they be able to differentiate at this point, living off in the wilderness with Prester John here, the Roman governor, king, Emmanuel, governor of the Romans, Christ, Lord Jesus Christ, Esau's Christ? Is this not Esau's Christ? Right? And who's he being served and worshipped by? This is the 10 tribes. And the Greeks and the Romans, all hidden away in the west in Eden, celebrating this false Christ. And he's celebrating himself, of course. So you might say it was arrogance on behalf of these, the popes were saying, oh, you're a very arrogant king. But that's how he saw himself. And what he says is that where then is this remarkable country? Back to the 3 Our magnificence, writes Prester John, dominates the three Indias and extends to the farther India. The body of St. Thomas the Apostle rests. It reaches through the desert towards the place of the rising of the sun. So it goes all the way to the east. It continues through the valley of deserted Babylon, close by the Tower of Babel. The four rivers that rise up out of the terrestrial paradise, according to the second chapter of Genesis. Furthermore, like the land of Havilah, around which the biblical Pishon flows. And then it talks about how the rivers of Gihon also flow there, and they compass the whole land of Ethiopia. So I've shown you guys that map again that I've seen on other people's videos. I just am putting this all together, so where it talks about this river that encompasses the whole land. And remember I was saying that I think that down here is where the sea, Humorous Sea is down here. And so this is where all the waters come from, and they go to the north to the indrawing seas, right? And so you see how the land was very much broken here. It looks like in these older maps, but they're not, like, I don't think Atlantis is this big and everything and Mu and all that. I think it's exaggerated. It seems like the Mongolian hordes take things more so in Eastern Europe, but it seems as though in North America, Prester John is really ruling up until the time of the official arrival of Columbus. And I think that he has the 10 tribes doing the giant slaying, which is one of the things that because this is from the time of the captivity of the 10 tribes that this Prester John thing is happening. And so this would roll in with Alexander the Great going on his great Iliad journeys into the west, slaying giants to prepare the land for Babylon as well, right? And trying to rule the world. And he does take over the world, and the kingdom is divided. Alexander the Great is also related to the Egyptian kings via Amalek. Amalek is the son of Eliphaz. Beyond this river he goes on are 10 tribes of the Jews who, though they pretend to have their own kings, are nevertheless our servants and tributaries. The 10 tribes are tributaries to the Edomites. We already went over that just now, but the connection I want you to notice here is this. So the 10 tribes were tributaries to these Edomite kings. And so these Edomite Kongs or Prester Johns ruled in the west, in Cathay, amongst the 7 nations. And then these 10 tribes were always at war with the 7 nations, killing giants or just at war with the mongrels. Okay? Says his domains are twice as great as all of Christendom. It says in an English version of the 1507, for example, the weak kings of the above passage become a great king of Israel, whom Prester John concedes to be twice as strong as I am. His dominions are twice as great as all of Christendom and Turkey, and he hath under him 300 kings, 4,000 princes and dukes and earls and barons and knights and squires, without number. Here he seems to have become an alternate version of Prester John himself. So it may be that these are a number of different kings, or this is an amalgamation, and then he's ruling over all of them, and he travels around, and you'll find that that's true. There's other books that reveal more of that. So we see here that when we look at the 10 tribes who are in America, we see in these paintings that they've obviously painted on this long straight hair to match the Native Americans of today, quote unquote. You can see in the bottom row that by the ears of especially the first king on the left in the bottom row, that he's been very whitewashed. His ears and the back of his head is definitely black, and then the front of him looks lighter. It looks like these paintings have been whitewashed over and over, and then they just plain said, look, we can't whitewash it anymore. Let's create a whole new painting, which was this other painting. But what I'm trying to show you here is that these are these kings who are ruling in this land in North America, giving tributary to Prester John. And then eventually the right hand and the left hand come together. And Charles V now and his offspring begin to replace the image of the 10 tribes kings. Why? Because now is the time of their demise. Columbus has come, and now Charles and Isabella are going to slaughter and take all the wealth. And the 10 tribes, along with people like Alexander the Great, who was considered a god, like Hercules, or the offspring of Amun-Ra with his red hair, slew many giants. That's what Israel did. They slayed giants. So they cleaned up the land, they covered up all the pyramids, and then it's time to build the new Babylon. So the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And so this is why the Holy Roman Emperor, where he comes in, and he is a Prester John, and he is of the Holy Roman Emperors. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And so how can we track this back a little further? Prester John, King of Kings, Lord of Lords of the earth, by the power and virtue of God and our Lord Jesus Christ to Emmanuel, governor of the Romans. What Prester John is described as, governor of the Romans, Holy Roman Empire. So how do we get here? Where are all the images of these kings in Europe? And now, of course, people are finding more and more of them. Whenever I was looking for images of these kings and knights and everything in Europe, so we return to the topic of St Maurice and the question of who all of this royalty is that is portrayed in all of this jewelry and all these artifacts and sculptures in Europe. And so what we said was that there is this myth of this Maurice that came from, I would see these images of these black knights everywhere. And they're calling them all the same guy, St Maurice. I can't believe how much this guy got around Europe. He was everywhere and everyone made a statue of him. I was just like, who would believe such a... I would just be like, oh my gosh. And I would be looking at them going, okay, who is this really though? So these are the black Moorish knights and nobles and aristocracy in Europe, Germany, all the way through Britain. And so this is the legend of St. Maurice actually masks the black aristocracy. Okay? And here's where you can find the information. You can go to Real History. So let's look at the legend of St. Maurice because it ties back to all of this. Okay, so there's this story about this St. Maurice who allegedly died circa 286, and he was a Christian soldier whose alleged martyrdom with his comrades inspired a cult still practiced today. Among those martyred with him were the SS Vitalis Candidus Experitus. So they were candid spirits, candid hidden spirits, candid people. He's a patron saint of the Vatican Swiss Guard. And the story is recorded of this PCO martyrdom. And basically it's the Passion of the Martyrs of Argonon. In the 5th century, French bishop Saint Eucherius believed that the Theban Legion was a group of Egyptian Christians serving in the Roman army under the command of Maurice, this guy. And ironically, they were sent by Maximilian, later the Roman Empire, to help quash a revolt of Christian peasants in Gaul. And the legion met with Maximilian at an Octodoron, now Switzerland. And they refused to fight against their brethren and withdrew in protest to Agaunum. And there Maximilian twice had 1 man in 10 executed, and finally the entire group was put to death. Okay, so this is the legend. So somebody doesn't want to fight with and kill their twin brother. And The earliest evidence of this consists of a letter during the early 5th century, and it names a 4th century bishop as the discoverer of the relics of St Maurice and his companions. And the fact that St Maurice is said to have belonged to a legion called the Baal, which was really stationed in Italy, suggests that Theodore, so now we've got Theodorus, Tudors, invented the story of St Maurice. Now notice these are all knights. You know, like Knights Templar, candid spirits of the Knights Templar, Knights of the Realm. All right, so they're all hiding some kind of secret. The whole story is out of proportion, and they doubt its historical basis. But it's really set up to cover up the black aristocracy because you simply don't cover all of your churches with these statues that have lasted for hundreds and thousands of years with black knights. You don't create all this jewelry and these expensive sculptures and everything of people who are not of nobility. And notice there really aren't any white knights around because this is an order that is hiding a secret. And if you'll notice in all of these cases, the bird of prey that all of these knights or these nobles are holding. So this is this goes all the way back to Charlemagne. Charlemagne was the first great royalty, like I said, of these empires. Okay, he was the one who held back the Arabs from invading into Northern Europe, into France. Eventually they did get up there, but he held them back, and he was black nobility. These are the Edomites. How do you know? Like I said, you see the eagle? Here's an eagle here as well. And of course, Germany was founded in 800 AD by Charlemagne, and that was just after the invasions of the Muslims into so-called Western Europe. So we see, again, you can't see the whole bird here, but with this particular knight, there's part of the eagle there. Here's the eagle again in this St. Maurice image, the bird of prey, the scavenging, ravaging bird. When we look at Charlemagne himself, Charlemagne and the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus waged war on both land and sea to control Venetia and the Dalmatian coast of modern-day northern Italy, Slovenia, and Croatia. The war progressed well for the Franks. Additionally, beginning in 809, Nicephorus was distracted by a new war with the Bulgars. Therefore, the Byzantine began negotiation with the Franks. Peace was agreed upon, in which Charlemagne gave up most of the Dalmatian coast in exchange for the Byzantine emperor, recognizing him as emperor of the West. Charlemagne busied himself with driving the albinos back to the east. So these are the Japhethites, the Eastern Europeans. So these are all black men, okay? I showed you Ivan in the last video, the Byzantines. They're black. These are all black people. Between 802 and 812, Charlemagne fought the Saxon tribes located in the north. In the beginning of the war, Charlemagne gained his reputation as a ruthless warrior. He massacred over 4,000 Saxons. Still, the warfare with the Saxons continued on, and he fought them nearly 30 years. He brought Saxony to his kingdom in 808 to 810, and he settled accounts with the Danes, the Danites, who had given aid and asylum to the Saxon leader Wundekund. In the Saxon Wars, Charlemagne's forces subdued the Slavic region of Bohemia and the modern-day Czech Republic. He provided a good government for his kingdom. He had outdoor meetings, etc., etc. He ruled for about 47 years and provided a prosperous and stable country. So that is Charlemagne. Please go to KMZ's channel because he goes way better and way more simply into depth on this than I do. So what we see before 1400 and then all the way to 1556, we see the banner of the German imperial empires. And all of them are the eagle, especially the double-headed eagle. another Black Knight, a noble of the Holy Roman Empire, who is purposely falsely identified as St Maurice. Okay, but it's really hiding their secret aristocracy that took over all of Europe for the Edomites. And they worked together through the various branches of Edom and with the Danites. So here's the story as to how the official Roman emperor, Holy Roman Empire, was chosen and why. So this is just a complete fabrication, right? The priest king of the earth, right? It is now 799 AD, and for the third time in half a century, a pope is in need of help from the Frankish kings. After being physically attacked by his enemies in the streets of Rome, their stated intention is to blind him and cut out his tongue to make him incapable of that. It's obviously, the Knights Templar. Pope Leo makes his way through the Alps to visit the king of the Franks, Charles I. So Charlemagne is Charles I. Charles I. Charles I. At Paderborn. It is not known what is agreed to, but Charles travels to Rome in 800 to support the Pope, and in a ceremony in St. Peter's on Christmas Day, Leo is due to anoint Charles I's son as his heir, but unexpectedly it is maintained as Charles I rises from prayer, the Pope places a crown on his head and acclaims him emperor, and Charles expresses displeasure but accepts the honor, and the displeasure is probably diplomatic, for the legal emperor is undoubtedly this public alliance between the Pope and the ruler of a confederation of black tribes now reflects the reality of political power in the West, and it launches the concept of a new Holy Roman Empire, which will play an important part throughout the Middle Ages. So this is the new Prester John, okay, just before the transatlantic slave trade and the Inquisition. And so this is Charlemagne, king of the Franks. This is the original picture. They have this sculpture, but this is a true rendering of him. So he looks very brown. 742 to 814 AD. And he is known as the Illuminator Master Lucen, also called Master Etienne Loipu. So this is almost like so Lucen implies Lucifer. And Lucifer is very much associated with Esau's Christ. So this is a Holy Roman Empire. And Emperor Charles I. So this is another kind of Prester priest king. Charles the Most Serene Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor, governing the Roman Empire. I don't know if, to me, these are the things, the associations I'm making. Again, guys, this is theory, but this is what I'm seeing. And so these are the images. Why would you have this great aristocracy, these beautiful renderings? Eventually we get to Charles V in the 1500s. Okay? Carlos Quintos. People like this Duke of Edom, Prince Henry the Navigator in 1394, the Portuguese explorer going all over the world. Okay? And even to the west, where the kings of the 10 tribes are ruling under Prester Johns there. And so here's the Prester John again. This king is, and we see these conquests of these lands that are Hebrew lands, and you know they're Hebrews. Why? Because they're wearing the mitre on their head. A lot of people don't read scripture enough to, in the mainstream, of course, the Hebrews, the Israelites, we know about it, but they're all wearing the mitres, and they're fighting in a war against the Europeans, because this is their land. These are Knights Templars, okay? There is something secret, a secret society going on that is hiding the Presters and their ultimate agenda. So after that, we have white Europeans, the Lithuanians, taking over these empires. And Esau Edom is mixed in with all of them. And of course, we have John Henry Hoffman V, who is a black descendant of Charlemagne, who lives in Europe, and he's a German, Frank. Okay? And so he is black royalty, in Europe. And he's a producer and an actor, and so he is a descendant of these wealthy Edomites. This is a phony St Maurice meeting with the Pope, but this is obviously a king meeting with the Pope and his other knights of the Knights Templar and the whole secret hidden society. This is a fresco of King David done in 1411 from the Hall of Giants. These are people or a culture that knows about giants in Fornio, Italy. And King Dawid is portrayed as black. Not just because he's a brown-skinned person, but because of the whole Prester thing. But eventually a lot of the original blacks there, along with the Edomite blacks, are moved out by the white Europeans. The German Palatines are from the Middle Rhine region of the Holy Roman Empire, including a minority from the Palatine. The region was repeatedly invaded by French troops, which resulted in continuous military requisitions and widespread devastation and famine. The poor Palatines were some 13,000 Germans who migrated to England between May and November 1709. Okay, so then when they were there, the German government couldn't integrate them. See, these are black Germans, okay? And then they were having these debates over the merits of immigration. And so they tried to settle them because they had tried to settle them in England and Irish colonies, right? So these settlements did not prove viable long-term, except those settled in Wexford and Limerick and in the colony of New York in British North America. They transported nearly 3,000 German Palatines in 10 ships in 1710, and many of them were the first assigned to work camps along the Hudson River to work for their passage. Close to 850 families settled in the Hudson River, primarily in what are now Germantown and the Sogerites, New York. In 1723, 100 heads of families from the work camps were the first Europeans to acquire land west of Little Falls, New York. Additional German Palatines settled along the Mohawk River for several miles. Okay, so a lot of people think these are German people, but these are actually black people. Black Germans. And how do we know? Because you guys would have seen this in a lot of videos. A lot of people who do historical videos about all of this stuff always cite this letter from Benjamin Franklin. And this is what he says about the Germans, and this is how we know. Since the detachment of English from Britain sent to America will have their places at home so soon supplied and increase so largely here, why should the Palatine Boers, okay, be suffered to swarm into our settlements by herding together, establish their languages? So Beor was one of Edom's sons, and so the Boers are associated with Edom, black. These are Juda Israelites and 10 tribes Israelites mixed in with the Boers, mixed in with black Edom. By herding together, establish their languages and matters to the exclusion of ours. Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. So these are the 7 nations, Septimus Severus, in North America, okay? These are the Mongoloid people. Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of newcomers, wholly so. So they got the Mongoloids, they got the tawny Mongoloids there, But they also have the white people there, the white Europeans. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion. That means black or brown. As are the Germans also. Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased, and while we are, as I may call it, scouring our planet by clearing America of woods, and so making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light to the eyes of the inhabitants in Mars or Venus, why should we, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Why increase? So who are they talking about? They're talking about the gods of Mars and Venus. They're talking about the aliens, fallen angels. Okay? In the light, in their eyes. That's who they're pleasing. Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so far fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks and tawnies of increasing the lovely white and red? But perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. Now, usually they call the Edomite Jews the crypto Jews, but basically it was Esau and Jacob and Ishmael who came over to North America together, with Jacob as the indentured servant. So in 1860, there were 487,000 free Negroes in the United States, some of whom owned slaves. C.D. Wilson estimates that there are 6,230. The tax returns of Charleston, SC for 1860 showed 132 Negro slaveholders with 390 slaves. The Negro slaveholders, like the white ones, fought to keep their chattels in the Civil War. So there were Negro slaveholders, Esau and Jacob, right? So Esau is enslaving Jacob. Under indentured servitude, you're allowed to, in Torah, you are allowed to have your relative as a servant for like anywhere from 7 to 49 years, right? You have to be their redeemer. But it became chattel slavery. This is from Cummings in the Negro Question. I want to take a few pages and discuss the so-called convicts that were sent into the 13 colonies by the English. I have read plenty of books on this subject, and I've discovered that the word convict has been misapplied to these prisoners. When we think of convicts in this generation, we imagine thieves, murderers, pedophiles, rapists, and politicians, but that was not the case with these convicts. These convicts were political prisoners. The convicts that were sent to the colonies as free men or indentured servants were nobles, princes, barons, and princesses. Keep in mind that this was a latter group of black Europeans flooding into the colonies. When these black Scottish political prisoners arrived in the 13 colonies, the government had already been established by the free black Scots. In the book of Isaiah, it reads, "Behold, the land of the Chaldeans. This land was not till the Assyrians founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness. They set up the towers thereof and raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought it to ruin." This is the same thing that happened to the black founding Scots. They set up government of the 13 colonies, and the whites took it over. I have in my possession ships manifest that give a description of black Stewarts or Schwartz and other Highlanders that were deported into the colonies. See the ships manifest on the next page. What else do we learn? During the reign of black German King George I, 1714 to 1727, the Jacobites rebelled in England. This was nicknamed the 15 because it took place in 1715. The Jacobite Covenanters, or black Jews, were trying to wrest the crown from the black German kings Hanover and placed the black Stuart kings back on the throne in England, but this was not to be. Son, King Charles, etc. The Jacobites were imprisoned, executed, or sent to colonies or on convict ships. I want to remind you that the free black Scots that founded the Americas came during the reigns of King James, King Charles, the first, second of England, and James II of England. The free black Scots came into the Americas in waves. In Virginia in the 1600s, Georgia 17, Hampshire 1629, so here they are, Maine, Delaware, Plymouth, New Jersey, etc. The Second Jacobite Rebellion took place in 1745 under King George II, who was a very evil king, a black German king of England. Okay, King George, a black German king of England, was the first king in England to legalize the enslavement of men. When the state of Georgia was given the first charter slavery, when the state of Georgia was given its first charter, slavery was illegal, but in 1751, King George II legalized slavery. I want you to get this. There was no such thing as slavery in the British colonies because it was illegal. So King George, the black German king, legalized slavery in America, in Georgia. Esau versus Jacob. And so, and that's why you also have, I don't have it here, but there's also, it discusses the first time that chattel slavery is legalized, like in an indefinite period of servitude, not just a 7-year period, but indefinite one, is also by a black man in America who has a black slave. And again, I believe it's Esau and Jacob. This is where we connect the Holy Roman Empire and Columbus, of course, and all of the other visiting travelers with slavery and Germany and the king priests, the Holy Roman Empire. That then now at the time when Columbus comes, it's time for the great harvest and decimation. They were already serving Presters. They already had their images up. Like he said, they think they're kings. They think they're ruling. But we have a greater king who is over them all. They had good relations. And soon they just put up Charles's painting and then took over the whole king thing. And then they were put into subjection. Then they were bred in to all these different nations. So not only did the Mongoloids force breed a lot of the Israelites, but that obviously chattel slavery did. And so the 10 tribes, after submitting themselves to Esau's Christ, to Prester John as their God king, as their priest king, they were worshiping all kinds of things. They were not worshiping according to Torah. So by the time Columbus came and it was time for them to be enslaved, the fruit was ripe for the picking. Look at this picture of Montezuma, with the authority of the eagle and the serpent over his head, the serpent all around him, the eagle authority on his head. This is not just a plain old Mitri from Torah. He's got the eagle feathers on it, and he's surrounded by the serpent of the world. And what does he say at the sight of Cortez, the conquistador? We know, said the unhappy monarch in his first interview with the Spanish general, by our books that myself and those who inhabit this country are not natives but strangers who came from a great distance. All right, so Isaiah 28:15 says of Ephraim, says as of the 10 tribes, and of course all of Israel, for you said, we have made a covenant with death. We have fashioned an agreement with Sheol. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, it will not touch us, because we have made lies our refuge and falsehood our hiding place. And of course, this is now the warning to the Gentiles. So later, when Columbus finally comes to the West, what he admits is the absolute truth. And that is that he's communicating with Ferdinand and Isabella about his journey to America. And when he goes there, he says, in that same month, on the basis of the information I've given your highness concerning the lands of India and a prince called the Great Khan, which means King of Kings in our language, and of course we already said Lord of Lords, and how he and his predecessors often sent to Rome for doctors who could instruct them in our holy faith, and how the Holy Father never provided any, so that so many people believing in idolatries and proliferating prodigious sects among themselves have been lost. And so was Esau not keeping them in sin, worshiping a false king and Messiah that whole time? Esau's Christ? Wasn't he pretending to be Esau's Christ? And this is the left hand, so when the right hand arrives in the form of now another Christ, false Christ, they're steeped in idolatry and ripe for punishment. Khan means King of Kings. It doesn't just mean that. It's a derivative of Canaan. Canaanite, Khan, wrath of Khan, Mongoloid, mixed race, confusion by mixing. And so that is the kingdom of the priest, king priest of Babel own. How they began again the destruction of the temple of Israel here in the West. The rise of the 7 nations. Okay, so thank you so much for watching Baruch Atah. Shalom. Please like, subscribe, and share. Like, subscribe, and share. I encourage you to make a donation at livelightwell.com, intoalltruth.net, and in order to obtain a calendar, the Moed appointed times, and Chaya Eat Life and Fast. They enable us to live our lives Hebraically, to line up with the appointments or meetings with our Creator, who pours a message and a word into us and guides us into all truth. And it's by using these types of tools that we can remain faithful to our Elohim's word and enter into the promise. Okay, so it's not just a cookbook, Chaya Eat Life and Fast. It's about a Hebraic lifestyle, fasting, and the divine procession of life and order, and the Hebraic foods and healing, okay, from a Hebraic perspective. And so it helps you to line up with Yah's commands. In terms of the calendar, I'm going to also publish a 10 tribes calendar that will line up, for those of you who like, with the equilux rather than the equinox, so of Addis Ababa, Guinea-Bissau, and that will go all the way to the Amazon or Guinea River of South America. So that will be the kind of 10 tribes one, or calendar, we'll just say. Okay? Shuvah Yahua Revot Yasharel. Return, O Yahua, to the countless thousands of Israel.
Israel, who love, worship, and praise Yahweh. Give him thanks by saying hallelujah.